In 2019, a family of 4 moved into a new house in a quiet suburb in Hawaii. They loved it until they discovered the dark secret their house held. This story is easily one of the spookiest true stories I have ever come across. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, when the like button calls your restaurant to place a very long and complicated order for delivery, let them finish in their entirety before telling them they are outside of your delivery range. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Brittany Campbell jetted off to the very famous Little Vegas Chapel, which is located just off the Las Vegas, Nevada Strip, and they got married by a man dressed up as Elvis Presley while the couple stood in front of a pink Cadillac. While their wedding was certainly not traditional by Western standards, it somehow seemed fitting for the newlyweds. After all, they were not a traditional couple. Brittany, who was 36 years old, was extremely energetic and outgoing and bubbly, and she even referred to herself as being a little crazy. As for James, who was 35 years old, he was reserved and quiet and kind of analytical and would rarely act on impulse. And on top of these two just being complete and total polar opposites, they had actually dated previously back in high school, and it had not worked out. They had broken up and gone their separate ways, not expecting to see each other again. But nearly 2 decades later, they randomly reconnected, and this time they had something major in common. James was a single father of 2 young boys, and he was desperately looking for a partner to not only share his life with, but someone who would come in and help him raise his kids. As for Brittany, she too was single, and she really wanted to be a mother. And so the timing of their reunion was perfect. A year after the wedding, James, who was serving in the US Navy, was given orders to spend a couple of years working out of a naval base in Hawaii. So the family of 4, along with their little cat named Mr. Franklin, packed up all of their things and left the mainland of the United States, and they landed in Honolulu, which is the capital of Hawaii. The family would move into a modest 2-story home located just a couple of minutes drive away from the airport. The house was located at the end of a cul-de-sac in this very quiet and safe neighborhood that really didn't look like the type of neighborhood you would expect to see on a beautiful Hawaiian island. It really just kind of looked like typical American suburbs with all these cookie-cutter 2-story houses right up next to each other on either sides of the road, and out front everyone's got a white picket fence. But for the Campbells, who had never lived in Hawaii before and were used to living on mainland America, it was actually kind of nice to move into this neighborhood and have it look kind of familiar. And so before long, the Campbell family loved their new Hawaii house. That is, until they learned their house had a dark secret. It all started in June of 2019, so not long after the Campbells had moved to Hawaii. Brittany, she had to go into the garage to get something. Now, their garage was attached on the left side of their house if you were looking at their house from the street, and there was a door on the first floor of the house that led into the garage. And so Brittany, she walked across the first floor, she opened that door in the house, she went into the garage, she flipped on the light switch, and what she saw all over the garage made no sense to her. They still had a bunch of moving boxes that they had not unpacked since they'd only been in Hawaii for a matter of weeks. And so all these unopened boxes, they had just kind of stacked up inside of the garage. But when Brittany had turned the lights on and looked into the garage, she saw nearly all of those boxes had been toppled over, and lots of the contents inside of these boxes had spilled out onto the ground. But even more bizarrely, it looked like it wasn't totally haphazard. It looked like someone had intentionally kind of sifted through the boxes and taken out random objects and put them into strange piles that didn't make any sense. The objects were not alike. Or they had taken the objects and kind of stood them up in these strange arrangements, almost like they were being laid out for a garage sale. And so Brittany immediately just turns around and she leaves the garage, she goes to the other side of the house, and and she gets her husband. She brings James back and he looks inside. He's just as shocked as she is. And the two of them immediately just go into the garage and begin looking through all of the stuff to see if anything is missing. Now, it was pretty difficult to tell if something had been stolen, but they did have some valuable stuff that was in those boxes that had been pulled out and was lying on the ground, and that wasn't missing. And so that was a pretty good indication to James and Brittany that this wasn't a robbery. And so the only other thing they could think of would be that their two young sons must have come in here and been goofing around and pulled the boxes over, and so this is their doing. But when the parents confronted the two young sons, they said they didn't do it. Brittany believed them, but James didn't necessarily. He thought they could be lying about it, and if they were telling the truth, then, maybe one of their pets had gotten into the garage and caused all this chaos. They had purchased a dog when they got to Hawaii, so they had a cat and a dog. And so James was just being very dismissive of this whole garage incident and not taking seriously the fact that Brittany was really spooked by this. But regardless of how the family members felt about the garage incident, they all just kind of moved on because there really wasn't anything to do except pick the garage up and continue on. About a week after the garage incident, Brittany was home alone one morning getting ready. She was sitting in the master bedroom in front of her mirror and she was applying eyeliner and she had a YouTube video playing some makeup tutorials. And as she's applying the makeup, she suddenly hears the front door downstairs slam shut. She almost pokes her eye out with her eyeliner. She's so startled by the sound of it. And she immediately pauses her YouTube video and she calls out for James and her sons, believing they must be home and somebody slammed the door. But when she calls out, she gets no response. Now, immediately, Brittany is going through all of these different rationalizations like, okay, maybe James and the boys opened the door, they got something or put something in the house, they slammed it and they left. And so that's why they didn't hear me call their name. But she couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. She's also thinking about the garage incident, which really never left her. She pretended like she had moved on, but really she hadn't. And so she stands up and she begins walking towards the open door that led out into the hallway. And then from the master bedroom, if you were looking out into the second floor hallway, it basically went straight across to another door. That was her son's bedroom. And in between these two doors, basically halfway down the second floor hallway, to the left was a flight of stairs that went straight down to the first floor. And when you reached the bottom of those steps, right in front of you would be the front door, the door that had slammed. And so Brittany reaches the threshold of the master bedroom. She's looking out into the second floor hallway. She doesn't see anyone. And so she yells out again for James and for her sons, but again, there's silence. And so she takes a deep breath and she begins walking down the second floor hallway, and she makes it halfway. She turns left and she gets onto the stairs. And as she's walking down these steps, the house is eerily quiet and she's got this growing sense of dread inside of her, and she's kind of quietly calling out for James and her sons, but it's totally quiet. And she gets to the foot of the stairs. She kind of scans around her. She doesn't see anyone. And then she walks to the front door. She flings it open, expecting, hoping to see James's car in the driveway or just see some indication that her husband or her sons had been there or were there. But when she opened that door, James's car was not there. There was no sign of anybody in the area. It was just her. And so with her heart racing, she shut the door, she locked it, and then she walked all around the first floor, checking every window, checking every door, making sure everything was locked. She went upstairs, she did the same thing, checking every room, every closet. There was no one in the house with her. She was sure of it. And so she went back to her room thinking to herself, what do I make of that? How do I reconcile the fact that I clearly heard the front door slam, but no one's here? And so Brittany would eventually leave the house and go about her day. And then that evening, she would come back home and her husband and her sons would be there. And at some point, she would bring up the slamming door to her husband to get a sense of, could that have been him? And he would tell her that no, he had not come by the house that day, so that could not have been him. But he assured his wife, don't worry, you probably just unlocked the door and a draft came through and slammed the door. You got nothing to worry about. But Brittany would tell her husband that that was just not possible, that she always shut the door. She always shut and locked the door. So the idea that she had forgotten to lock it and had left it partially ajar enough to the point that a draft could slam it the way it did, it just didn't make any sense. But just like the garage incident, James was very dismissive and just told his wife, you're being super paranoid. You have nothing to worry about. It's just a door. Don't worry about it. But this really upset Brittany and she got mad at James. And before long, the two were just totally fighting about it. And by the time they actually laid their heads down on their pillows that night, They weren't even speaking. And so the couple that night, they fall asleep angrily, and then in the middle of the night, Brittany wakes up suddenly. She doesn't know why she's woken up, but she's kind of looking around the room. It's totally silent, and she's trying to get her bearings. And as she's sitting there, she hears downstairs, not a slamming door, but the sound of a door opening and then shutting. Immediately, she is on heightened alert. And instead of doing anything, she just kind of leans forward and listens really intently to make sure she really heard what she thought she just heard. And as she's sitting there listening, she can hear again another door downstairs, a different door, opening and then shutting. And at this point, she begins to panic. She reaches over, she shakes James awake, and she tells him, I can hear someone opening and shutting doors downstairs. Now, James was not remotely thrilled to be having this conversation. He was still mad at his wife for being so paranoid about the door earlier, and so to be woken up in the middle of the night to his wife freaking out about more doors being open and shut, he was just really upset. And so he sits up, he's totally annoyed, and he's not ready to really take seriously anything Brittany is saying, and Brittany's picking up on this. And so finally, she just says, James, did you lock the front door before you went to bed? And so James is like, yes, I locked the front door. I'm telling you, you're hearing things. There's nothing going on in this house. But Brittany was not convinced. And she says, you know what? You can think nothing's going on, but I'm going downstairs to make sure no one is in this house. And so Brittany would get out of her bed. She'd walk over to the open door that led into the second floor hallway. And as soon as she looked out, she didn't see anything. She didn't hear anything. And so very slowly, she began walking down the second floor hallway until she reached the top of the stairs. And at that point, she turned and looked downstairs into the pitch black first floor. She was terrified, but she knew she had to go down there to make sure her family was safe. And so down the stairs she went, and when she got to the bottom of the stairs, she saw right away the front door was unlocked. Brittany's thinking, why would my husband tell me he locked the door if it's not locked? And so then Brittany's thinking, okay, my sons must have gotten out of bed and they must have unlocked the door. That's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing these doors opening and shutting because my sons are down here somewhere and they're the ones causing all this noise. And so Brittany kind of felt relieved for a second because this seemed like what must be going on. But after locking the front door and then searching the whole first floor, she didn't find her sons. And then when she went upstairs again and went into her boys' room, she found both of them were fast asleep in their beds. And when she shook them awake, they showed no sign of having been awake recently. They were totally groggy and could not have been running around the house just minutes earlier. And so now Brittany is terrified. She tucks her boys back in and she tells them, everything's fine. But then she hustles back over to the master bedroom with her husband and she tells James, the front door was unlocked and our sons were fast asleep. It couldn't have been them. But James continues to be very dismissive, telling his wife, you are totally overreacting, you're being paranoid, you're just hearing the sound of those doors because you're scared. There isn't any doors slamming in the house. And as he's saying this, their back sliding door downstairs that led to their backyard suddenly slammed open and then slammed shut. And as soon as this happened, James, who had been so dismissive and totally skeptical, he instantly changed. And he looked at his wife and he said, you stay right here. And he jumped out of his bed and he ran out of the bedroom. A few minutes later, he would come back into the master bedroom and he would tell his wife that, yeah, the back door, it was unlocked, but it was shut. I'm sure you just forgot to lock it. And the same draft that is opening and shutting doors, probably opened and shut the back door too. So we got nothing to worry about. The house is locked right now. Let's just get in bed and go to sleep. And at this, Brittany is incredulous. And she says to her husband, you gotta be kidding me. There is something weird happening in our house. Doors are opening and shutting. We had that thing with the garage. You can't act like nothing is happening. And this, in turn, turned into a big fight. And so before long, the parents weren't even talking about who opened and shut the doors downstairs. They were just fighting with each other. And then eventually, they were just so tired that they gave up and they both went to sleep. For the next few weeks, nothing happened inside of the house. Brittany, though, continued to obsess over who or what had been causing those doors to open and shut, and then also, what happened in the garage, what caused all that stuff to fall out and wind up in these strange arrangements. Meanwhile, James continued to be unbelievably dismissive and did not want to talk about the potential for something strange happening in their house. But something strange would happen to just James without Brittany around, and that would be the first time that he would get really spooked. Today's video is sponsored by NordVPN. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is probably just another ad for cheap cigarettes for my pet dolphin. But no, It's not, don't worry. This ad is for all my good, honest, hardworking people that just want to kick back and relax and purchase a high-quality rabid turtle to send to the like button without being interrupted by disgusting pesky pop-up ads. If you're living this pop-up nightmare right now, then today is your lucky day because NordVPN exists. A VPN, or virtual private network, is a service that keeps you safe when you browse the internet, and NordVPN is the brand name in the VPN space. Not only will NordVPN ensure that all your data remains behind their wall of next-generation encryption, but also, most importantly, through their latest feature, Threat Protection, they will automatically block all those disgusting pop-up ads that have been destroying your opportunity to buy a quality rab turret. NordVPN's Threat Protection will also protect you from malicious sites, trackers, and downloads. So, you can either go waste your money on any of the hundreds of so-called deals out there for cheap dolphin cigarettes, as if that exists, or you can be a big dog, sign up for NordVPN, and buy an infinite number of quality rab turrets without interruption. Talk about a no-brainer. Currently, the best deal for NordVPN is through my YouTube offer. Right now, NordVPN is offering viewers an exclusive 2-year plan at a huge discount, plus an additional month free when you go to nordvpn.com/MrBallen. And it's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. Again, that's nordvpn.com/MrBallen, or click the link in the description below. Okay, back to the story. It was a couple of weeks after the nighttime door slamming incident, and James, he was alone at his house. It's the middle of the day, and he decided he would just play the piano. And so he moved to his piano in the living room, which is on the first floor. He sat down and he began playing. And then after a little while, he started to feel like he was being watched. And it got to the point where it was so uncomfortable, he had to stop playing and actually look around and make sure he really was alone. And when he did that, he noticed out the window to his right, which led into the side yard, that there was clearly a figure standing in the window outside looking in with its arms down. But there was a curtain over the window, and so all he could see was this shadow figure standing at the window. And so James is immediately startled, and as soon as he reacted to this figure, the figure suddenly starts moving towards the back of the house. And so James, he gets up and he rushes over to another window that looked into the backyard, and he looks outside, and there's no one there. And then he goes back to the window he originally saw the figure in, he opens it up, there's no one there. And so James would ultimately tell himself that, okay, that must have just been some nosy neighbor that heard the music, they came over, and they noticed that maybe I saw them, and they ran off before I could see them. And so that's what it was. But deep down, what he saw in the window really shook him up. However, it would be the blanket incident that would finally push James to go from being dismissive and skeptical to admitting to his wife, we got a problem. It was not long after James spotted that dark figure outside of the window when he and his wife and his 2 kids decided they would head out to a movie theater to catch a movie. And so as they're getting ready to go, Brittany would say that she wanted to bring along a particular blanket that the whole family loved to use when they were sitting on the couch. She was going to bring that blanket with her to the movie theater to kind of cuddle up under for the movie. And so she would make her way into the living room and she would see the blanket was missing. It was not on the couch where it normally was. And so she would ask her husband and her sons if they had any idea where it was, and they would say, no, we haven't touched it. She would look all over the place, under the couch, in the living room. She went upstairs. She couldn't find it. And so finally, they just left without the blanket. But when they came back that evening, there on the couch, folded up neatly, was this blanket. Everybody knew that blanket had not been there when they left. So how did it get there? For the next few weeks, the parents did their best to put on a brave face and tell their kids that everything was okay, but the parents and the kids were all terrified to be in that house. And that's because, at night, the doors continued to open and shut. Their dog periodically would just start barking in the middle of the night for no apparent reason, and they would all get this awful sense that they were being watched all the time in their house. And so finally, by September of that year, the parents decided, we just have to get out of this house. We cannot be here. We need to take a break. And so they packed up their stuff and they flew to mainland America, where they stayed with some family for a week. On September 20th, they hopped back on a plane and they flew back to Honolulu. And as they're driving from the airport to their house, Brittany and James were just kind of secretly hoping that, whatever weirdness was happening in their house would just magically stop once they returned. But as soon as James turned onto their street and they could see their house, they knew that was not going to be the case. Because as they began driving up their road, they could see James's very nice road bike was laying on their driveway. And so Brittany, she turned to her husband, and even though she knew the answer, she said, "James, were you riding your bike before we left?" And James, who doesn't even look at his wife, just shakes his head. No, he wasn't. And so James drives all the way down the road. He turns into their driveway, which is lined up right with the front of the garage door. And after James parks the car, he hits the garage door opener button. And so as James is sitting in the driver's seat, Brittany's right next to him, the kids are in back. They're watching as this door is raising right in front of them. And as soon as they can see into the garage, they see everything in their garage has just been completely trashed. Things are not just dumped out, but things have been ripped apart and shredded as if a wild animal had been let loose inside of the garage. James immediately said to his wife, "We've been robbed." And then he hopped out of the car and then turned and told his kids, "You stay in the car, do not get out." And James, he went over to the side of the house and got a sledgehammer for protection and made his way to the front door. Meanwhile, Brittany would be on the phone with 911 to report that someone had broken into their house. A few minutes later, James was inside of his house and he saw the entirety of his house was just like the garage. It had been completely ripped to shreds. But amidst the chaos were those kind of strange piles of random objects, much like they had seen in that first garage incident where the things inside of the boxes had been stacked in kind of strange piles and arrangements. And so James is looking around his first floor and he's seeing stacks of coasters and books and electronics. But what really got James's attention was that on various surfaces, there were these medical vials of drugs or chemicals that were placed all over the place. And he knew that was not his family's. Someone had brought those vials into this house. James would make his way up the stairs to the second floor landing, and right away he could tell, the upstairs had all the hallmarks of being destroyed as much as the first floor. But when he went left and went into his boys' room, he saw that room was pristine. In fact, it had been cleaned. The boys' laundry was neatly folded on one side of the room, their beds were perfectly made with military precision, and all of their toys and different things that were normally all over the floor were neatly put away in the places they should go. And so James would turn around and leave his boys' room in absolute astonishment, and he would walk across the second floor hallway into the master bedroom. And what he would find in there would make an already terrible situation much, much worse. The master bedroom was destroyed like the majority of the house and garage, except the top of their bed was not covered in junk. Instead, on their bed was this towel that had been neatly laid out, almost like a tablecloth. And laying on this towel, neatly spaced apart, kind of perfectly arranged, were a bunch of knives. And then next to the knives, still on the towel, was a laptop that the Campbell family owned, but they didn't use it. It did work, but it just kind of sat in the master bedroom. And this laptop was sitting on this towel, and it was open, but the screen had turned off. And so by this point, Brittany had come upstairs. And so Brittany and James, they walk over in horror to this layout on their bed, and they click the keys on the keyboard of their laptop, and it illuminates the screen and shows whatever was being worked on last. And it's this long, long Word document that neither of them made. They scrolled to the top of this document, and the document was titled The Omnivore Trials, and then below that it said, A Rehabilitation for Rat-like People. And then below that, the entire document was kind of like a diary. It was a whole bunch of observations about so-called specimens, and these specimens were very clearly the Campbell family. And these observations made about the Campbell family were very intimate. In fact, the only way to garner these observations were if you were watching the Campbell family right up close, almost on an hourly basis for days, weeks, months at a time. These observations ranged from what time the Campbell family liked to watch TV to what James and Brittany talked about behind closed doors in their bedroom, including their struggle to have a child, something they were not not talking about to their family. But in this document, the author of the Omnivore Trials would talk about how the creature, which was referencing Brittany, needed to stop trying to have another baby and instead focus on the children she already had. Toward the end of this really lengthy document, the author of the Omnivore Trials came to a shocking conclusion that in order to rehabilitate these rat-like people, the Campbells, the author would have to perform several surgeries on the specimens. These surgeries were hand amputations and gender reassignment surgeries. And then after this conclusion, there was another note that detailed all the different surgeon tools the author would need to perform these surgeries, as well as a list of drugs and chemicals they would need in order to sedate these specimens before they performed these surgeries. And so after James and Brittany see this, they realize that those knives laying out on the towel were for them. Those were the knives that were going to be used for the surgeries. And all those weird vials, those medical vials they saw all downstairs, those were likely the drugs that would be used to sedate them so they could go under the knife. 15 minutes before James and Brittany went into their house and discovered the knives, the medical vials, and the laptop, James grabbed that sledgehammer and walked to the front door while his wife called 911. And so James, he gets to the front door, he puts his key into the lock, he unlocks it, and with the sledgehammer in one hand, he attempts to push the door open. But despite the door being unlocked, he can't open it. There's resistance behind the door. And so James kind of gets down and he presses as hard as he can into the door with his shoulder until finally it opens up just a crack and James can see into the house. And so James, as he's pressing the door barely open, he's staring into this crack, trying to make out what's going on inside of his house. And then suddenly a set of eyes meet his from behind the door. And before James can do anything, this man that is standing inside of his house says to James,
"This is not your house,"
and then proceeds to push the door shut on James. James, in an adrenaline-fueled fury, smashed the door open, grabbed this guy, and yanked him out of the house and threw him onto the front yard. And then James, with his sledgehammer, would stand in front of this guy between him and his kids and his wife, and he would say, "If you go anywhere, I'm going to have to attack you with this." But the intruder, this guy, whose name was Ezekiel Zayas, he was a 23-year-old young man, he would just stand on the Campbell's property, staring directly at James, unblinking. And then, a couple of minutes later, the police would show up, and Ezekiel would not put up any fight. He would be arrested, and he would be taken away. It was after he was gone that James and his wife would actually go into their house, and they would see the state it was in, and they would go upstairs, and they would discover the knives and the laptop. It would turn out, months earlier, Ezekiel had apparently found a way to sneak in and out of the Campbell's property. And so around the time they had moved in, Ezekiel was living there as well. He was mostly living in the crawl space above the second floor bathroom. And then whenever he was able to, Ezekiel would climb down out of this crawl space and he would go and observe the Campbells. And this was not just at night. Based on some of the observations inside of Ezekiel's Omnivore Trials document, clearly he was watching the family in the middle of the day too. Also, based on these observations in this document, it was pretty clear that Ezekiel was getting ready to actually carry out these surgeries on the Campbell family, meaning the Campbells' decision to go on vacation when they did could very well have saved their lives. And if there was any question as to whether Ezekiel could have actually carried out that level of physical harm on another human being by carrying out those surgeries, well, after he was arrested for what he did to the Campbells, while he was in jail, he beat his cellmate to death. Allegedly, although a guard literally walked in and saw Ezekiel punching and kicking and beating this guy, and then he died. But technically the trial is not over, so it's allegedly. Ezekiel is currently in a state hospital, and they are trying to determine if he is fit to stand trial for what he did to the Campbells and for what he did to his cellmate. Even though it might be self-explanatory at this point in the video, it's worth pointing out that we have no idea what Ezekiel's motives were for why he did the things he did to the Campbell family, or what he was looking to achieve with the so-called Omnivore Trials. We also don't know why he allegedly killed his cellmate. As for the Campbells, this whole experience was so traumatic that they did not stay at their Hawaii house. They moved, and as of today, their whereabouts are unknown. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, when the like button calls your restaurant to place a long, complicated order for delivery, wait until they're completely done to tell them they are out of your delivery range. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We now have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast, and we upload brand new stories on Monday mornings. On Thursday mornings, we upload remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my wife, my family, my team in supporting those who have been most affected by violent and heinous crime. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We also have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen Shorts. The other is called MrBallen en Espanol. We also post near daily content on Facebook and Snapchat. Those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. We have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So, whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.
Today, I'm going to tell you 2 stories that each of them at first glance will appear to be sort of a run-of-the-mill true crime story. But they are not. I promise you, stick to the end of each of these stories and you'll hear 2 very unique, very sort of unbelievable plot twists. But before we get into those 2 stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the Like Button's house and log on to their computer and email love letters to all of their work contacts. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the afternoon of April 25th, 2007, a 25-year-old police officer named Martin Arnold and his partner Michelle sat in their police cruiser in the parking lot of a public park in Heilbronn, Germany. They were on their lunch break, and Martin was eating a sandwich and looking out across the park, which was mostly empty because it was a weekday afternoon. So Heilbronn was a medium-sized city in southern Germany, and it was generally a pretty safe area. I mean, for the most part, the worst crimes committed here were like break-ins or muggings. So Martin and his partner, they didn't have a whole lot of action happening around them. However, something Martin and Michelle and basically all police officers for the most part in Germany were acutely aware of was over the last 14 years, all across Germany, there had been this rash of crimes ranging from, home invasions and robberies to at least 2 murders that had basically all been committed based on DNA evidence by the same person, this singular woman whose nickname was the woman with no face. And she still hadn't been caught yet. And so in essence, all police officers in Germany were sort of like always on the lookout for this woman. She was like the most elusive and sought after criminal in the whole country. But on this particular day, as Martin sat in his cruiser on his lunch break, he wasn't really thinking about how he might get involved in capturing the woman with no face. Instead, he was just worried about his sandwich. And so he went to take another bite of his sandwich when he heard the back doors of his cruiser open up. And he whipped around and he looked, and there were these 2 people who had approached the cruiser, and each of them were carrying a gun. And before Martin or Michelle could do anything, these people raised their weapons and they fired, and everything went black. Within minutes, officers from the Heilbronn Police Department had swarmed the scene. They found Michelle, who was deceased from a gunshot wound to the head. And Martin had also been shot in the head, but he was still alive. He was just unconscious. And so an ambulance rushed him to the hospital while detectives taped off the crime scene and began looking for evidence. Some officers immediately began canvassing the area looking for potential witnesses. But because the park was basically empty all day, there was nobody who had seen the shooting. Other officers looked for footprints in the ground, around the car. They also began looking for fingerprints on the car, bullet casings, hairs, other fibers inside or outside the car. But there was nothing. And so at this point, the investigators are like, okay, all we know is there's been at least one shooter, maybe multiple, because they have not spoken to Martin, who's unconscious. They have no idea what he's seen. So they're seeing that at least one person has managed to come up to a police cruiser, undetected presumably, open up the doors, shoot both officers in the head, and then get away without leaving behind any obvious evidence. It just seemed crazy. Like, have we just missed something? Like, there's got to be something here that sort of points us in the direction of who was responsible. And so in a last-ditch attempt to find something helpful at the crime scene, one officer swabbed the inside of the car for potential DNA evidence. They knew that if there was DNA, it could belong to Martin or Michelle or anybody else who might have been inside of this car, and any of those people didn't have to be the shooter or shooters. They could just be people in the car. But it was possible that DNA found inside that car could belong to whoever did this. However, they wouldn't know about this DNA sample until the crime lab analyzed the swabs, and that could take a really long time. But it was certainly worth it. And so they sent the swabs off for testing. While they waited for the DNA results to come in, the Heilbronn PD continued trying to find witnesses or any other helpful evidence, anything, but they kept coming up empty. Their only potential witness here was Martin himself, but he was still in a coma at the hospital. It was not until weeks later that finally the police had something to go on, because the DNA results came back. And not only was there DNA found in the car, but what this DNA revealed sent the media into a frenzy and brought this investigation to the national level. At this time, it's mid-2007, and a 44-year-old German prosecutor named Gunther Horn was sitting in his office when he got a call from his boss. And his boss told him, the woman without a face has struck again, this time in Heilbronn. Gunther's eyes went wide, and he immediately sat up and listened really intently as his boss explained that 2 police officers in Heilbronn had been shot in the head while parked in their cruiser near this park, and the woman with no face, her DNA had been found in the backseat of their car. Now, Gunther had always been fascinated by the woman without a face, so he was ecstatic when his boss asked if he, Gunther, would lead the investigation into this most recent crime in Heilbronn that was potentially connected to this woman, and to try to finally identify who she was once and for all. Gunther immediately said he would do it, and he got to work. Right away, Gunther organized a task force to investigate this woman without a face. The task force was based in Heilbronn, but at Gunther's command, detectives on the team began reinvestigating all these crimes from all over Germany that this woman was involved in. They searched for patterns, for evidence, or witnesses that maybe had been missed during the original investigation. And through this effort, this team was able to come up with a very rough idea of who this woman was. They knew that she was very likely a heroin user because police had once recovered a heroin needle with her DNA on it at a public park. They also knew she had a lot of criminal contacts because many of her crimes involved co-conspirators. But anytime police had interrogated her co-conspirators, they had refused to say anything about her. It was like they were afraid of her. And there were a couple of other details that struck Gunther as being pretty odd. The only evidence this woman had ever left behind at any of these crime scenes was her DNA. And they didn't have a match in the database to pair it with, so they only knew she was a woman, but they didn't know who she was. In 14 years, she'd never left behind a fingerprint, a footprint, a hair, or anything else. So it seemed like, her crimes were extremely deliberate, very clean, very well planned, but also she was clearly leaving behind her DNA at all these crime scenes. It almost seemed like that was her calling card. Also, what Gunther and his task force discovered is that in many of the crimes committed by the woman without a face, witnesses described seeing what looked like a man at the scene, not a woman. And this was obviously weird because based on the DNA evidence, they knew unequivocally that their suspect, this woman without a face, was biologically female, not male. And so to Gunther, it seemed like, maybe this man that was being seen at these crime scenes was just one of the woman's co-conspirators, or maybe the woman without a face dressed as a man to avoid being caught. but it was impossible to know without a first-hand witness who had actually seen the suspect up close. That was what Gunter really needed. And in late May, about a month after the shooting in Heilbronn, Gunter got a call about that exact type of witness that he was looking for. That same day, Gunter walked into a hospital in Heilbronn, and he saw Heilbronn police officer Martin Arnold laying in a hospital bed with his eyes open. He'd been in a coma for a month now after being shot, but he had woken up. And he clearly was Gunter's best chance of catching the woman without a face, because presumably, before he was shot, he might have gotten a look at her. So he was that witness who might be able to describe her. And so Gunter, he walked over, sat down next to Martin's hospital bed, and he asked him to please tell him everything he remembered about what happened. And Martin, he was very distraught about the whole thing. He's just woken up. He's just learned that his partner has died. And so he's very emotional. But he ultimately tells Gunter that, realistically, he can't really remember what happened. He basically turned around, he saw there was, these two figures, but after he got shot, it was like he just didn't remember anything. And so realistically, Martin had almost nothing to offer, which meant Gunter was back to square one. For the next 2 years, Gunter and his task force worked tirelessly to try to catch the woman without a face. They spent millions of euros, clocked thousands of hours of overtime, and even offered a reward equivalent to $400,000 for information. But none of it led anywhere. And adding insult to injury was the fact that the whole time this investigation is going on, the woman without a face kept committing crimes. The task force connected her to at least 6 more break-ins, 1 more robbery, and another murder. And these crimes weren't even just happening in Germany anymore. They also found the woman's DNA at crime scenes in France and in Austria. So now the entire region was on alert for this woman who seemed like this impossibly cunning international criminal genius. And Gunter, he couldn't help but start to wonder if he would ever be able to catch her. But then, in March of 2009, Gunter got a call from a police officer in France. And what this officer told him would change everything. According to this officer, the French police were currently investigating a potential murder. They told Gunter that a badly burned body had been found in France, and it was so disfigured that for a while, all police knew was that it was a man. However, an asylum seeker who had come to France had recently been reported missing, and police wondered if maybe the body belonged to him. So, on a hunch, they had gotten his asylum application paperwork, which included his fingerprints, and they'd been able to lift a DNA profile from those prints. But when they had the DNA analyzed, the results didn't make any sense. And the French police were so baffled by these results that they were now calling Gunter, because they knew if there's someone who needs to know about this, it's Gunter. And so Gunter, after being fully filled in about the baffling results that they had found, he was also at first very confused, but at the same time, he felt this new surge of hope. Because to him, it felt like, as bizarre as this was, maybe this was the break he'd been looking for the past 2 years. Maybe this was the time he was finally going to figure out who this woman really was. So he thanked the French police officer and then brought this new information to his team. And within just a few days, this new information from France did lead Gunter and his team to the woman with no face. It would turn out this woman, the international criminal mastermind behind dozens of crimes, including at least 4 murders, who had evaded capture for 16 years all across the entirety of Germany and beyond, appeared to everybody who actually knew her as a totally normal person. Like nobody suspected she was actually responsible for all these horrible crimes. She was a young woman who lived in southern Germany, who during the day she appeared to work at a factory, and at night she appeared to just go home. Like she lived a very ordinary life. And so again, nobody ever suspected her. But what the French police found when they analyzed the DNA from the missing man's asylum application was that that man's fingerprints somehow contained this woman's DNA. This was clearly impossible. Primarily because the man was biologically male and the woman without a face was biologically female. They knew that. So even if the asylum seeker had secretly been this woman, that wasn't really possible. And so when the French police saw this, they knew they had to tell Gunter because he was in charge of the woman without a face investigation. And when he and his team looked into this, they figured out something shocking. It was precisely this woman's normal-seeming life, in particular, her very normal-seeming job at the factory, that made everything she did possible. Because at this factory, this woman sat on an assembly line, helping to manufacture the very cotton swabs that police use in DNA testing. On any given single shift, this woman would touch hundreds or even thousands of these swabs and would accidentally leave her DNA behind on each one. There was no international serial killer, woman criminal mastermind parading around the whole country. No, there was just a lot of contaminated cotton swabs. And so in essence, police had wasted all this time, nearly 2 decades, millions and millions of euros, and thousands of hours of overtime, chasing a criminal who didn't exist. It was later determined that the police officer Martin Arnold and his partner Michelle were shot by 2 members of a neo-Nazi group. However, many of the other murders previously attributed to the woman without a face are still unsolved, primarily because police spent so long chasing the wrong suspect. Today, the case of the woman without a face is considered one of the biggest embarrassments in German police history. On the afternoon of May 2nd, 1930, a middle-aged woman named Kim Soo-jin walked into her farmhouse in a small village called Bibongmyeon in what is now South Korea. She had spent the whole day working outside on her farm, and now all she wanted to do was grab some water, sit down, and finally just rest for a second. But before she could do any of that, she heard a knock at her door. And even though she was exhausted, the sound of this knock actually sort of energized her, because she was pretty sure that her 16-year-old son, Bak Chung-soo, had finally come home. So Soo-jin and her son ran this farm together, just the 2 of them. And they really barely made any money doing it. In fact, a lot of the time, they didn't even grow enough food to feed themselves. So to try to make ends meet, Soo-jin's son had recently started a full-time job at an inn in town. And he also frequently did odd jobs in the village for extra cash. The problem was, Soo-jin's son would sometimes go straight from his job at the inn to one of those odd jobs, and he didn't always have time to stop by to tell his mother where he was going first. And remember, this was 1930 in rural Korea, so it wasn't like he could just call her. And so basically, this mother was left to worry about her son kind of frequently. And over the past 6 days, that is all Soo-jin did, because she had not seen or heard from her son at all. And even though he did go, days at a time in the past, doing these different odd jobs, this stretch was a pretty long time for him to be gone. But she told herself what must have happened is he must have found work with a family who was, having him work and live with them full time. That this was just a great opportunity and he had taken it, and surely he would be home soon. And now it seemed like maybe, just maybe, he was home. So Soo-jin, she rushed to the front door, she opened it up, and the smile on her face faded immediately, because it was not her son standing at the door. Instead, it was 2 police officers. And the first thing they asked her was if she knew of any teenage boys who were missing from the village. And Soo-jin told them that, she had a son of her own who was a teenager. He was 16. And the reality is she didn't know where he was, and he'd been gone for the past week. But don't worry, he wasn't missing. He was very likely just working for a family somewhere, and he'd be home soon. But after she said this, the police looked at Soo-jin with clear pity on their faces and told her they were so sorry, but they were nearly certain that her son had been murdered. Soo-jin just stared at them in shock and disbelief as they told her that a few days ago, during the time her son was gone, a teenage boy's body had been found on a nearby mountain. An autopsy showed he'd been beaten and strangled to death. And for the last couple of days, the police had been traveling all over the village, interviewing people and trying to figure out who this boy was. And based on everything they'd learned so far, Soo-jin's son was actually the only teenager in the area who wasn't accounted for. But hearing all of this, Soo-jin did not think this could be true. Her son stayed out of trouble and worked really hard. She couldn't imagine why anybody would want to hurt him. So she just told the police, this has got to be a mistake. But the police didn't seem to think so. They just said that they needed her to come to the local hospital morgue to identify the body. A little while later, Soo-jin arrived at the hospital with the 2 police officers. And as they led her through the entrance, down a few hallways, and towards the morgue, She kept telling herself that her son was okay, he was still alive, and this really has to be some sort of horrible mistake. It has to be. But the second she actually walked into the morgue and saw the body lying on the table, her eyes welled up with tears because she knew it was her son. And to Soo-jin, this moment felt like leaving real life and entering a nightmare. Her son's face and body were covered in bruises and wounds, and he was very clearly decomposing. I mean, it was just awful to see. But as this mother is sort of just staring down at basically a parent's worst nightmare here, she noticed something strange. She turned to the police officers and she told them that this was her son, definitely. But the clothes he was wearing were actually not his. And for some reason, to Soo-jin, the clothes thing felt very important. So she started rattling off ideas for, where they could have come from. It was like her brain suddenly became fixated on this one aspect to avoid touching on the trauma of losing her son. She began telling them that, maybe the family he was working for let him borrow them, or maybe he bought them without her knowing, or maybe whoever killed him dressed him up for some reason. But when she said that last part, it was like all at once, the reality of her son being dead just came crashing down on her. She started shaking, and before she knew it, she had collapsed onto the floor and was sobbing hysterically. Less than a week later, Soo-jin was sitting in her farmhouse, staring out her front window in a daze, when she saw the police walking towards her house again. Over the past few days, she hadn't heard any updates about her son's case, so she'd just been at the farmhouse all alone, trying to make sense of his death. But now, Soo-jin sees these officers, and so she goes right outside and she meets them and she asks them, do you have news for me about what happened to my son? And they tell her that she was likely going to have to sit down to hear this. Soo-jin figured it couldn't be worse than finding out your son's been murdered, so she said, okay, let's go inside. And so they went inside the farmhouse, they sat down, and then the police told her that they figured out who had killed her son. They told her they had not one, but two people in jail right now who had both issued full confessions. Both of these suspects were people that Soo-jin's son, Chang-soo, had worked with at the inn in town. One of them was a young man and one was a young woman. And apparently, Chang-soo had gotten involved in the woman's personal life. She was having an affair with a married man, but was planning to run away with a different man from the village soon. And Chang-soo had told the married man about it. When the woman found out that Chang-soo had done that, she was furious, so furious that she conspired with her co-worker, the young man, the other suspect, to lure Chang-soo out to the mountains under the guise of gathering wild vegetables. And then when they got there, the man and the woman beat up Chang-soo and then strangled him to death. This had all happened on the first night that Chang-soo had left the farmhouse. So over that 6-day period, he pretty much went out and immediately was killed. And so over those 6 days, he was never, living with a family and working for them. He was just dead on the mountain the whole time. The police told Soo-jin that they had charged both suspects with murder. But after hearing all this, Soo-jin still had one question. What about her son's clothes? Was there anything in the suspect's confessions about that? But the police just shook their heads, no, and said the clothes didn't really seem relevant to the case anyway. And this time, even though Soo-jin, did feel like the clothes have to mean something, she didn't argue or even, try to come up with other theories about the clothes. She just sort of accepted what the police had told her. As horrible as it was to know that her son was murdered over something so petty, she was at least glad to know that his killers were behind bars. Soo-jin eventually got her son's body from the police, and she was able to bury him in the local cemetery. And then after that, she did her best to try to move on, but she never could. And as this nightmare kept happening night after night, Soo-jin slowly became convinced that her son was haunting her dreams. And so Soo-jin basically stopped sleeping, couldn't really eat, certainly couldn't work. Her farm fell into disrepair. She actually began to think she was just gonna wither away and die here unless something changed. I mean, this was horrible. She was overcome with grief and sadness and also just scared. These dreams were terrifying. But then on the night of October 18th, 1931, so about 6 months after her son was killed, Soo-jin woke up from yet another nightmare. When she opened her eyes, she saw this shadowy figure at the foot of her bed, and she immediately realized that it was her son's ghost coming to visit her. But Soo-jin, she wasn't scared. She actually felt tears welling up in her eyes, and she actually just began speaking. She told the ghost, "I love you, but you have to move on. You have to rest in peace now. You have to." Now, Soo-jin really didn't know what she expected to happen here when she began speaking to the ghost. But what did happen was definitely not something she would have considered, because suddenly the ghost opened their mouth and they spoke. And what the ghost said changed everything. It would turn out Chong-soo, Soo-jin's son, had been viciously attacked by that man and woman up on the mountain. They really had beaten and strangled him and left him for dead. But he didn't die. He survived the attack. And when he came to, he fled the area because he was fearful if he went back home, they would finish the job. They would attack him and kill him. So he didn't have a chance to tell his mom that he was basically on the run. And so for 6 months, he's living in random towns, doing odd jobs to survive. But eventually, 6 months in, he misses his mom, he misses home, and he goes back and he walks into a room in the middle of the night. He is the ghost. And when she said to him, "You need to rest in peace now," he just says to his mom, "I'm not dead." And he was just being honest. "I'm here, I'm back, I survived." It would turn out the body that was found on the mountain was just some other teenage boy who was never identified, by the way, who happened to be in the same area where he had been attacked. And so when word got out about this body being found on the mountain, the man and the woman who had attacked Chong-soo, they're like, "Shoot, that's him, that was us." And they confessed to killing him because that's what they tried to do. They tried to kill him. They didn't kill him. It was some other body. And then when Soo-jin went to the morgue and saw this body, it was decomposing and he basically looked like her son. And so she misidentified him. She thought it was her son, but it really wasn't. And she fixated on his clothes and she was like, "Something's off." Well, she was right. It wasn't her son. It was someone else's clothes. And so in the end, the man and woman who had attacked Chong-soo had their murder charges dropped because they didn't commit a murder. And they were both ultimately released from jail after serving about a year in prison for the assault. As for the actual person who was found dead on the mountain, they were never identified and they were buried in a sort of unmarked grave. And the location of that grave has been lost to time. And so even though we have the ability today to test for DNA, we're not able to exhume them because we don't know where their grave is. And so very likely we'll never know who that person was.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time. On the evening of December 14th, 2024, a woman in her mid-30s named Priya got ready for bed inside of her home in Chehenkalo village, which is a rural community in central India. Priya put on her PJs, brushed her teeth, and then climbed into bed by herself. She was waiting for her husband, 35-year-old Anand Yadav, to finish his bath and then come in here and join her. And as Priya laid there, just waiting for her husband, she couldn't help but feel like their house was so quiet. And in many ways, the quiet of their house was this constant reminder of this really deep sadness in her life, which is, Priya really wanted a kid, but she and her husband had struggled to get pregnant. And now, they're in their mid-30s and it just seemed like time was running out. And, it's like all she wanted was a family and she didn't know if she would actually have one. Now, for Priya, though, this was not some new revelation. Like, this pain had been going on for years. And so, like she did most nights, as she laid in bed waiting for her husband, she just did her best, not to dwell on it and just think about the other things in her life that were going well, like, her relationship to her husband
They were very happy and a very healthy couple. And so she's sitting there and she's thinking about that and again, trying to be grateful when the door opens to the bathroom and Anand comes out. But he's not dressed for bed. He's wearing a bathrobe, like he hasn't gotten dressed yet. And he's acting kind of funny. And Priya, she's looking at her husband, trying to figure out, like, what is he doing? Why isn't he dressed? What's going on here? When she suddenly realizes his face is like bright red. Clearly, there is something wrong with her husband. And then before she can ask him what's going on, Anand just turns and runs out of their bedroom, just wearing his bathrobe. And so Priya, she gets out of bed and she chases after her husband, trying to make sense of what the heck is going on here. She gets outside and she sees her husband is now collapsed on the ground outside. And so Priya really does not know what's happening here. She has no sense of what could be wrong. And so she just runs over to her husband and she rolls him over and she's shaking him to get him to talk to her. But all she sees is his face is still this beet red color and it's almost like he's passed out or something, like he's not responsive. And so really having no clue what else to do, she just rushed next door to her relative's house. She got some family members, they came outside and together they scooped up the non-responsive Anand, threw him in a vehicle, and they rushed him to the hospital. And when they got to the hospital, Priya leapt out of the car, leaving Anand and her family behind, and she bolts inside. She tells the front desk attendant what's going on, that her husband, he's not breathing, he's unresponsive, he's in the car. And so right away, medical staff came charging out. They went and they got Anand, they brought him inside, and before long, Priya is running behind all the doctors and nurses that are rushing Anand on a gurney through the hospital to an exam room. They get in the exam room, and even though Priya, she's kind of off to the side, she can't really see what's going on, but she can see the doctor who is primarily trying to figure out what's wrong with Anand. And she sees at first he's kind of doing a couple things to see if he can get Anand to start reacting to him, but pretty quickly she sees this doctor just kind of sit back, and there's this look of pity that comes over his face. And he turns and he looks over at Priya and he tells her that, unfortunately, your husband is dead. Now for Priya, this whole thing has happened so quickly that it's almost like she can't even begin to process it. And so instead of, becoming hysterical with grief, her first thought is, how could he have died? Anand was a healthy guy. He's, 35 years old. He's in the best shape of his life. He's a happy guy with a robust social life. There's no reason he should be dying right now. What in the world happened here? What killed him? That's her question to the doctor. But the doctor said, I don't know. The only way we're going to be able to figure out what happened here is to do an autopsy because there's just nothing obvious. And so sure enough, a couple of days later, the hospital's pathologist was, inside of an exam room with Anand's body laying on a table right in front of him. And this pathologist had done countless autopsies. This was, very standard work for this doctor. And so the pathologist, they went into this autopsy really not having any idea what killed this guy, but in their head they were thinking, okay, maybe it was a sudden heart attack because this sort of seems like that could be it. And so they made their first incision on Anand's chest, and the first place they went to look was Anand's heart. But after looking at Anand's heart, they determined that no, he did not go into cardiac arrest, he did not die from a heart attack. This death was not connected to his heart. And so the pathologist naturally moved from the heart to Anand's lungs, which is another area that, he believed could have something to do with this death. But after checking those out, it was clear the lungs did not have to do with Anand's death. And so after that, the pathologist wound up checking all of Anand's organs, trying to find any sign of what killed him, but there was nothing. There was no indication that this guy should have died. Now, the pathologist was a little bit surprised because they figured, by this point, they would have had the answer of what happened to him, but it's no matter. They'd done many autopsies before where it required some, further looking to figure out what happened. And so they moved on and they made an incision in Anand's throat. And when they opened up Anand's throat, the pathologist just stepped back and gasped because in their entire career, they had never, ever seen anything like this. It would turn out that Priya was not the only one who felt deep sadness around not having a family yet. Anand as well was just really heartbroken over the idea that, he was never going to become a father. And so, without telling his wife, Anand had gone out and sought out professional help for their fertility issues. However, the type of professional help that he sought was a little bit unorthodox. Instead of going to see a licensed doctor, Anand went to see what's called a tantric, which is basically a practitioner of occult magic. And this tantric gave Anand instructions for how to perform this ritual that supposedly guaranteed, if he did it correctly, that he would be able to have his child. Anand clearly believed this tantric, and so after being given the instructions, he went out and gathered the necessary resources, and he took them home. And then on the night that he died, while Priya was in bed waiting for him, and he was in the bathroom, taking his bath or whatever, well, at some point in the bathroom, Anand performed this fertility ritual, and it killed him. Anand, per the tantric's instructions, had taken a living baby chicken, a chick, and attempted to swallow it whole. Apparently that was all he needed to do in order to have a child, as he so desperately wanted. But when he swallowed this chick, it got stuck in his throat, and within minutes, he suffocated to death. And also, unfortunately, the chick died as well. One morning in late November of 1979, a 64-year-old man named John Perrin walked through a park near his home in East London, South Africa, which is a small coastal town. The park was basically a forested area that ran right along the coastline, so even though John was walking on a trail through all these trees, he could literally hear the ocean waves crashing down on the beach below. And being out here was actually a pretty big deal for John, because he didn't come to this park very often. In fact, he pretty much never left his house, because John was a total recluse. And, in addition to not leaving his house, he basically spoke to nobody. He didn't have friends, didn't have family. He basically had this one cousin he spoke to sometimes on the phone, but that was it. This guy was very isolated. But today, something in John had told him to go outside and go to this park and take a walk. It was just like this kind of weird intuition that he couldn't even explain. But he just hadn't questioned it, and here he was, doing what his gut was telling him to do. So now, he followed the trail through the woods and listened to the ocean down below, and he eventually went around this bend, and when he did, he saw there was somebody on the trail up ahead. It was this young man who John had never seen before, and this young man looked really anxious. He was sort of pacing back and forth on the trail, like he was trying to maybe build up the nerve to do something. At least that's what John's first impression was. Now, to John, this guy did not feel like a threat to him. It just seemed sort of odd what he was doing, and so John was curious, and so he continued walking down the trail closer to this guy to see what was happening here. Remember, John thinks he's here for some really divine reason in some ways. He doesn't really know what it is. He thinks his gut intuition has brought him here. Maybe it's this guy. And so he's walking down the trail, sizing up what he's doing. And as he gets closer to this man who's pacing back and forth, John realizes that the man is sort of pacing up to the edge of this cliff. Basically, again, this park sits right on the coastline, but the coastline is way down below. And John realizes this guy is pacing back and forth to the cliff and then going back over to the cliff and then back. And this is a massive drop off. This cliff is all the way down to the beach, easily a fatal fall if you were to fall off the cliff. And suddenly it clicks for John. This young man is contemplating taking his own life. He's working up the courage to jump off the cliff. At least that's what John is thinking. The young man is so locked in on what he's doing, he's barely even registering that John is here. He's still just pacing, building up the courage, again, it appeared, to jump off this cliff. And so John's standing there, not really sure what to do. And also there were these other people that were also on the trail that had sort of taken notice of the situation. And there was this crowd forming, sort of standing a little bit back of this young man, not wanting to unintentionally, startle him and get him to jump off the cliff. Everyone's just kind of standing there watching. But for John, as he's standing there, almost paralyzed, not knowing what to do, he's watching this guy go back and forth. And then it was like everything clicked. Suddenly, John understood why he was here. His gut instinct had brought him here to go up and interact with this young man. And so John broke from the crowd. He walked up to this young man who was still pacing back and forth, and he put his arm around the young man, and he looked at him and he said, "I'll show you how it's done." And then John walked to the edge of the cliff and jumped. And the young man was so shocked by this that he just stood there and he watched as John plummeted down to the beach below and smashed into the ground and died. And this young man, I mean, he's so horrified by this, so shocked, that he decided he wasn't going to jump after all. Seeing it happen, seeing John do the thing that this young man was there to do, to jump off this cliff, to take his own life, to see somebody else do it was so awful that he decided not to do it. And so as he's having this revelation, the young man also distinctly felt grateful to John, for doing what he did, because in watching what happened to him, it showed the young man that in fact, he did want to live. At 1 a.m. on March 3rd, 1944, a young train operator named Michel Palo stood in the caboose car of a freight train that was slowly going up the side of a mountain in southern Italy. Michel's job was to operate the brakes for the back half of the train. And tonight, he had to be on high alert because they were traveling under really dangerous conditions. In fact, Michel was worried they might not even make it to the next stop. So first of all, it was raining and snowing outside, so the tracks were naturally very slippery, which meant it was going to be harder for the train to get the traction it needed to go up the mountain. Second, the train's engine wasn't working as well as normal. And that was in large part because the coal the train company had to use was this really cheap, crappy kind of coal. Because this is 1944, World War II is raging, and a coal shortage had been created as a result of that, because all the good coal was being shipped off to be used in the war. And so, this train company had the bad coal. And then finally, the train was just way too heavy. Even though it was only supposed to be carrying the, small crew and the freight, the reality is there were over 500 stowaways on board weighing the train down. Again, this is World War II. There are all these people that are trying to flee war-torn parts of the world, and one of the ways they would do that is by stowing away on trains. And now Michel and the other crew, they were aware of these stowaways. It was not subtle. They're literally in the cars, they're on top of the cars, and they're just trying to make their way into Italy to get away from, war-torn parts of the world. And Michel and the other crew, they were supposed to call security and, tell these people to get off the train, but they didn't do that. They felt bad. And they sort of felt like, allowing these people to, make their escape was, a morally good thing to do. But tonight, between the horrible weather making the tracks slick and, the coal that was not very good and sort of made the engine not work very well, and all this additional weight from the stowaways, it just seemed to Michel like if there was ever going to be a time that this train could not make it up the mountain, it was going to be tonight. And so the reason he's on high alert is if the train reached a point where it could not go any higher for any of the reasons I've just told you, the train would start to backslide. And that's incredibly dangerous, and it would be on Michel and also the engineers at the front of the train to hit the brakes and stop the slide. And so Michel, he's on high alert, he's got the lever for the brakes, he's watching for any sign of the train slowing down, something like that. And they begin to make their ascent up this mountain up ahead. And at first, it's going relatively fine, but it was just very clear to Michel, who knew this train well, that it was struggling to get up the tracks. But he saw up ahead there was this tunnel they would have to pass through before they made the trip the rest of the way up and over the mountain. And Michel's thinking, great, the tunnel is going to provide us dry, clean tracks where the train, if we just get into that tunnel, we can sort of get some momentum, get through the tunnel and ride that momentum because we know the tracks are going to be good up and over the rest of the way. And so Michel he's anxiously watching as the train is sort of sputtering its way up towards this tunnel. He knows that's going to be the key. Just get to that tunnel and we'll be able to get over this mountain, no problem. And so up they go, inching their way, and he sees the front of the train goes into the tunnel, and right away he feels like the train's gaining a little bit of speed here as more and more of the train is getting onto those dry tracks in the tunnel, and they're moving right along, but then sort of inexplicably, the train begins to slow down as the train is, again, entering into this tunnel. Remember, it's late at night, he can't really see what's going on, he can just tell that there's the tunnel, the train's going in, but we're slowing down here. And in fact, by the time that the caboose, where Michel was about to enter into the train, the last car here, the train had finally slowed down so much that the train actually came to a stop with Michel and the caboose right outside the tunnel. So, 99% of the train is in the tunnel. Michel and the caboose are outside. The train is now fully stopped. Now, generally speaking, the conductor, who was situated in the very front car of the train, was overall in charge of the train. And so in any sort of emergency situation, it was often on the conductor to sort of make the call about what the crew was going to do in response. Now, the train was clearly not backsliding. There wasn't an active emergency here, but Michel knew that this is wrong. There really wasn't a clear reason they should be stopped here. If anything, again, this tunnel represented their best chance to move quickly and gain momentum and ride up and over this mountain. And so Michel does not know why they're stopped, but clearly there's some sort of issue. However, Michel knows from his training that what he needs to do is still be wary of the brake here, because for all he knows, maybe there is some issue with the train and it is backsliding, but it's just slow. And so he needs to be ready to hit the brakes. And so what Michel did is he held the brake and waited for a signal from the conductor. Basically, the conductor would blow a series of whistles that, Michel would be able to translate that would tell him what to do, whether it was, lock the brakes or come up and talk to me or any number of different things he might need to do in this situation. And so Michel, he's just sitting there waiting for the train whistle, but there's nothing. There's just quiet. There's no other sound except for the idling engine, towards the front of the train. And so Michel, he just started to have this bad feeling that this doesn't make sense. There's no good reason why we've stopped here. And so Michel, operating on gut instinct here, despite not getting any signal from the conductor, no whistles, no anything, he abandoned the caboose, he abandoned the brake station, and began walking from the caboose basically up the center of the train, going into the next car. And when he got into the next car, it's totally dark because it's 1 a.m. This car is the first car that he's walking into that's in the tunnel, so it's very dark. And he did have a flashlight, but he didn't want to shine it on the people who are sleeping in here because there's hundreds of stowaways. These people have had very bad luck. They just want to get out of the country. And so as quietly as he could, he's walking through the aisle of this next train car. And, he doesn't notice anything. Everybody is asleep for the most part. And he's walking along. And as he gets to the next train car, he realizes he's starting to hear a new sound. And it's not coming from in the train. It's coming from somewhere outside in the tunnel. It's like this loud thumping sound. Something is hitting the rocks on the side of the tracks somewhere in the tunnel. And, Michel, he doesn't know what it is. He still doesn't know what's going on. He hasn't discovered any sign of, what has actually happened here. And so he just keeps on walking. And as he goes into the next car, he continues to hear all these thumping sounds somewhere outside. And the train's still not moving. There's no whistles from the conductor. By the time he's about halfway down that next train car, he's now into the second car he's investigating. He realizes that in addition to the odd thumping sound and the lack of movement and lack of anything really going on in this tunnel, he also realizes that the car itself that he is in is very quiet. Remember, there's basically dozens of people in each of these cars kind of laying on each other, sleeping as they make their way into Italy. And so for the first time, Michel turned on his flashlight and he's aiming it at the ground right in front of him. And he turned and began to scan all the stowaways sleeping in this car. And what he saw was so horrifying, he dropped the flashlight, turned, and ran out of the tunnel. It would turn out Michel was right to be concerned that this train might not be able to make it up this mountain. By the time the train sputtered into that tunnel, despite the fact that yes, the conditions were much better in the tunnel for the train to maintain speed and momentum, despite that, the other factors were too much to overcome. The train was too heavy from all the stowaways, and the coal was quite bad, so the engine was not as powerful as it normally would be. And so even though the tracks were not slick, it was just too much. And so the train ground to a halt inside of the tunnel. And so what needed to happen as soon as the train came to a stop like that is the conductor and the crew at the front of the train, they needed to basically jumpstart the train. They needed to put as much coal as they could into the furnace to get this engine turning enough that it could pick up speed again and continue their journey. They basically needed to rev the engine, if you will, and really fire this engine up and get it going. But in order to do that, They had to put a huge amount of this coal into the furnace to make that jumpstart happen. Because again, this coal is not high quality. It doesn't burn as well, it's not as efficient. And so basically what could have been accomplished with 2 times the amount of coal, you needed like 10 times the amount of this bad coal to do the same thing. But one of the byproducts of burning this type of coal, really coal in general, but especially this cheap kind of coal, and especially this much of this cheap kind of coal, is it produces a ton of carbon monoxide. And that filled this tunnel. Michel was outside of the tunnel. His caboose was the one car that was not in the tunnel. But everybody else on this train was suddenly being exposed to a huge amount of poisonous, lethal gas. And it killed virtually everybody on this train very quickly. Those thumping sounds that Michel was hearing were the sounds of people's bodies after they had died rolling off the train and falling to the ground. When he walked through the train car and looked around, the reason it was so quiet is everybody in these train cars were dead. Out of the approximately 600 stowaways and crew who had been on board this train, 521 were found dead.
Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. In order to appreciate today's story, I actually have to give something away right now. And that is, the main character survives. The reason I have to tell you that is because during this story, there is a really intense event that happens, and I use really specific descriptions for how something looked, how something felt, how something smelled, and if you didn't know I was pulling that from the survivor who lived to tell the tale, you might think I was just making it up, but I'm not. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button asks you to pick up some cereal for them, say yes, and then go to the store and buy the big single biscuit shredded On July 19th, 2013, 49-year-old Matt Dyer climbed on board a tiny 19-seat Twin Otter airplane that was parked on the tarmac of the Montreal International Airport in Canada. Matt was about to take off on the first of 2 flights that would take him and 7 other adventurous people deep into one of the most remote and wild regions in North America. For Matt, this trip was going to be the most amazing journey of his life. He had seen the ad for this 2-week-long expedition about a year earlier when he was looking through a magazine put out by an environmental organization called the Sierra Club. Now, even though Matt was a lawyer, he didn't make much money. He lived in this tiny town in central Maine where he made a living by offering either free or very low-cost legal assistance for some of the state's poorest residents. But Matt was an avid outdoorsman, and when he saw the opportunity to explore one of Canada's newest national parks that was so far north it was practically in the Arctic Circle, he decided the hefty $6,000 price tag was well worth it. 2.5 hours later, after flying over 900 miles due north away from the airport in Montreal, the Twin Otter airplane that Matt and the others were riding on touched down on a narrow gravel landing strip situated between this huge forest on a mountainside and a river on the other side. After climbing off the plane with all of their equipment, Matt and the 7 others hustled their way over to this stretch of flimsy plywood buildings that lined the runway. These buildings and this entire area they were in was was not a part of this new national park they were going to. This was like their staging area to prepare and get ready before catching another flight that would bring them into the park. And so Matt and the 7 other people he was with, which included the 2 trip leaders from the Sierra Club, they would stay at this temporary base camp for the next couple of days, going over their hiking routes and talking about emergency procedures and protocols. And then after those 2 days were up, the group felt like they were ready. And so the group packed up all their things and they boarded the tiny float plane out on the water that would take them to their final destination, this new Canadian national park, better known as the Torngat Mountains. 45 minutes later, the pilot of the float plane began to descend through the clouds to make their landing on a little water inlet. And as the pilot did that, Matt and the 7 others were able to look out the window and actually see the Torngat Mountains for the first time. Now, all of them had seen dozens and dozens of pictures of this area, but seeing it for the first time in person was still shocking. The area looks like an alien planet. The wilderness in and around the Torngats is not the same kind of wilderness we think of when we think about going hiking in the forest or going camping or something. No, the wilderness in the Torngats is primordial. It's like you're looking out at a place from the very beginning of time, like dinosaurs should be walking around this area. As far as Matt could see, in any direction were these huge, jagged mountains that had been carved out of the earth by glaciers hundreds of thousands of years ago. And those same glaciers had created hundreds of waterways between the mountains called fjords that almost looked like blue-veined fingers. And even from high up in the plane, Matt could look down and the water of these fjords were so clear that he could see these speckled backs of brown trout swimming beneath the surface. But while this landscape was undoubtedly spectacularly beautiful and pristine and totally incredible, it was equal parts unwelcoming to people. There are no roads in the Torngats, there's no campsites, there's no facilities, there's no internet, there's no cell phone, and the weather is unbelievably harsh. It's freezing cold and wet most of the time, and then even when it's a little bit warm and a little bit nice there, the weather can change in an instant and become freezing cold and wet all over again. And so, as such, the handful of visitors that go into this area every year are expected to be 100% self-reliant, because this really is one of the most dangerous wild regions in the world. But for Matt, as he looked out his window and surveyed this landscape, he wasn't second-guessing his decision to go into this hostile environment. No. I mean, the reason he was willing to fork over all that money to go on this trip is because he really wanted to experience extreme wilderness firsthand. And so finally, the pilot of the float plane came into land on this little water inlet, and then the pilot ferried the craft over to this beach, and then Matt and the 7 others piled off onto land with all of their things, and then as the pilot turned around and left, the 2 Sierra Club trip leaders, a 61-year-old man named Rich Gross and a 60-year-old woman named Marta Chase, told the group to pick up their things and follow them. And so Rich and Marta led the hikers about 500 feet away from where they had just been dropped off, up to this slightly elevated, mostly flat area that kind of overlooked the fjord and had this incredible view of all the mountains around them. Now, unlike the temporary base camp they had been at for the past couple of days, this camp was nowhere near any forests. They were basically on a wide open plain that kind of went right up into these mountains. So it's very wide open where they're staying. And so after Rich and Marta instructed the group where to set up their tents, Matt and the others got to doing that, and then after they were all set up, Rich and Marta put a small electric fence around the perimeter of their tents to keep any nosy animals out, and then the group headed up a little bit higher on this mountain near them to take their first group photo. And in this photo, they all look so happy and so excited for what's to come. And over the next couple of days, their trip would go exactly to plan. During the daytime hours, they would hike all of their pre-planned hiking routes all over the mountains and down near the water. And at night, they would eat their food and drink fresh water from the fjord and swap stories from back home. But their perfect trip was about to become a nightmare. I've been married to my wife, Amanda, for nearly 12 years, and I just love her so much. She's so thoughtful, so kind, an amazing mother, and so this Christmas, I wanted to get her something extra special to show her how much I care. And what's more special than a pet, middle-aged, rabid skunk? And so me and old Lungy hopped on my nuclear-powered laptop and began slapping away at the keys to navigate to an online vendor that sold rab skunks. But as soon as I clicked on the link, www.weselllrabidskunksandalsopudding.com, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. That website was riddled with malware, and so immediately my laptop began to melt down and literally exploded. Luckily, Lungy shielded me from the blast, and then after the nuclear winter had subsided, Lungy put on... And then after the nuclear winter had subsided, Lungy put on his traditional gakti and he said, Lopeta uden drayekeshen, ayutaninen rokeshta roidi NordVPN, which of course in Finnish means stop causing nuclear explosions. Sign up for NordVPN. A VPN, or virtual private network, is a service that keeps you safe while you browse the internet. And NordVPN is the brand name in the space. Not only will NordVPN keep all of your information safely behind their wall of next-generation encryption, but also, most importantly, they will block malware hosting websites along with annoying ads and botnet control. So, if you're tired of your Christmas shopping turning into nuclear explosions, then take Lungy's advice and sign up for NordVPN today. Right now, you can get a 2-year plan at a huge discount, plus 4 additional months for free when you go to nordvpn.com/MrBallen. And it's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. That's nordvpn.com/MrBallen, or click the link in the description below. Okay, back to the story. In the early evening hours of Tuesday, July 23rd, so 2 days after the group arrived in the Torngat Mountains, Matt and the others returned from one of their hikes. Now, the day had been cold and rainy, but the group was in good spirits. This was their last day at this particular camping spot. The next morning, they were going to pack up and head farther inland to their next camping spot. After Matt and the others had put their gear back inside of their tents, they came back out to see that Rich and Marta, the 2 trip leads, had organized a special feast for the group to celebrate the successful beginning of their trip. And so the group all sat around eating salami and crackers and drinking rum mixed with lemonade as they talked excitedly about the next couple of days and what they could expect. At some point during the festivities, Matt was tired, and so he broke away from the group. He climbed back inside of his tent, got inside of his sleeping bag, and before long, he was fast asleep. A few hours later, around 3:30 in the morning, Matt suddenly woke up. He had no idea what had woken him up, and so for a second, he just lay there listening to the outside world and just kind of staring straight up. Now, the moon was out that night, so there was some illumination, and as he looked straight up at the underside of his tent, he sees this huge figure move across the side of his tent and then stop right on top of him. And then before Matt's brain could process what was happening, this huge figure began pressing down on the fabric of Matt's tent. And so he's seeing his tent collapsing in on him. Matt's not doing anything. He's not saying anything. He's just watching in horror. And then suddenly the tent rips open and these 2 arms reach into the tent and they grab at Matt. And Matt threw his hands up in defense and screamed out for help. And as he did that, he suddenly felt this vice-like grip on the top of his head, and then before long, he was being pulled out of the hole in his tent out into the night. And as Matt is being dragged along on the ground, having no idea what's going on, he can't move. All he can hear is this crunching sound, which he would later find out was the sound of his skull and jaw breaking. And he started to smell this horrible rotten fish smell, and then he felt what felt like saliva coming over his face. And then Matt began kind of trying to look around because he couldn't really move his head, and he noticed all he could see was white fur. And it was then that Matt realized he was in the jaws of one of the world's most powerful and deadliest predators. Standing 10 feet tall on its hind legs and weighing as much as 1,700 pounds, the North American polar bear sits right on top of the Arctic food chain. And now this apex predator was dragging Matt by the skull down to the beach where Matt knew he would be eaten, even if Matt was still alive when the eating began. When the bear first ripped open Matt's tent and bit down on the top of his skull, Matt let out that scream, and it actually woke up the entire camp. And one of the first people to emerge from their tents to see what was going on was one of the trip leaders, Marta. And so she jumps out of her tent, and just 3 feet away from her, she sees this huge polar bear on its hind legs diving into the tent to get after Matt. And so Marta instinctively yells out to Rich to get his flare gun, and she dove back into her tent to retrieve her own flare gun. But by the time she and Rich had both emerged, gun in hand, this polar bear had already dragged Matt 200 feet away from the camp. And by this point, the other hikers in the group had also emerged from their tents, and after realizing what was going on, they just stood there, absolutely paralyzed with shock, staring at this bear dragging one of their companions down to the beach to be killed. Then, after Rich fired his flare gun generally in the direction of the bear, it kind of snapped the group out of their paralysis, and then moments later, they were all screaming and banging pots and pans to try to terrify the bear into releasing Matt from its jaws. Matt couldn't hear the sounds of his companions calling out to try to save him, nor did Matt feel any pain. He was in shock. The only thing going through Matt's head as he was being dragged along the ground to the beach was, I'm going to die. I'm either going to die on the way to the beach, or when I get there, then when the bear starts eating me, I'm going to die. And when he thought about this, it was with a kind of eerie, calm detachment. Like he wasn't sad or mad. It was just kind of a fact. This was going to happen. But as Matt was kind of making peace with his reality, Rich fired that flare gun shot, and that ball of chemical fire exploded basically right in front of the polar bear's face. And the polar bear, who was startled by the flare, instinctively whipped its head to the side, up, and then down again, and it didn't let go of Matt. And so Matt was whipped like a rag doll up, and then was slammed down into the ground. And when Matt hit the ground, he heard the sound of his neck breaking. But as Matt was laying there, the bear released him from its jaws, and then behind Matt, the bear turned around and began walking away. And so Matt could hear the sound of its big paws moving away from him, and suddenly Matt's thinking, oh my God, I might survive this. And so he tried to lay as still as he possibly could so as not to attract any attention, and he began repeating in his head over and over and over again, please bear, go away, please bear, go away. But as if out of a horror movie, as Matt is laying there repeating this phrase, he hears the sound of this bear stopping, turning around, and start moving back towards him. And so Matt's just thinking, okay, it's going to come back over here, it's going to bite my head, and that's the end. But luckily, Rich, by this point, one of the trip leads, had run down closer to the beach, reloaded his flare gun, and right as this bear was going to bite Matt again, Rich had fired that flare, and once again, the chemical fire had kind of exploded right near the bear, causing it to get startled. It turned around, it ran off, and this time the bear did not return. It would turn out Rich and Marta, the two trip leaders from the Sierra Club, had chosen a location for this campsite that was so heavily trafficked by polar bears, it was referred to as a polar bear highway. When all of the hikers, which included Marta and Rich, had been given their safety brief when they were staying in those plywood structures at that base camp near the runway, well, part of the brief was whenever you make camp in the Torngots, you want to be at least a quarter mile away from water. Go way inland because the polar bears hunt and fish and walk around right along the edge of these fjords. But despite all 7 members of this Sierra Club expedition being experienced wilderness backpackers, none of them really appreciated just how dangerous it was to be camping or even hiking around in known polar bear territory. And so this is why they ultimately ignored the safety brief and set up their first camp just a couple hundred feet away from the water's edge. And even prior to the attack on Matt, when the group literally saw polar bears wandering around near their camp, and even at one point had to fire their flare guns at the polar bears to get them to leave, the group still decided it was best to stay at this particular campsite. Perhaps they believed their electric fence they had set up around the perimeter of their tents would protect them from these polar bears, but obviously that had not been the case. The bear that attacked Matt had been totally unaffected by their fence. Matt would survive this attack, but really only because one of the members of the expedition happened to be a medical doctor, and so they were able to stabilize Matt until help arrived. Matt's injuries were extensive. They included a broken skull, a broken jaw. He had slash marks and puncture wounds all over his head and his neck, and all of those wounds got horribly infected. And also his voice was permanently changed as well, because the bear also slashed his vocal cords. Following the attack on Matt, Parks Canada, which is the agency that oversees all of Canada's national parks, including Torngots, has mandated that any organization going into Torngots National Park has to have a polar bear protection plan in place. As for Matt, he does not make a big deal about his near-death experience. In fact, he kind of makes light of it and sometimes even makes jokes about it. As for the polar bear that attacked him, Matt holds no ill will. If anything, the attack has made him more interested and appreciative of the apex predator. In August of 2014, so 11 months after Matt's brush with death, he returned to the Torngots and even visited the actual site of the attack, perhaps to get closure. Except this time, he was in the company of an armed polar bear expert. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button asks you to get them cereal, say yes, and then go to the store and buy the huge single biscuit shredded wheat cereal. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings we put out remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. Again, it's called the MrBallen Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click on Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, MrBallen Shorts and MrBallen en Espanol. We also post near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. All of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Check out our merch at shopmrballen.com, and if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit, just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today's story is about a lesser well-known cult and their heinous ritual that they admitted to performing. This episode is extremely graphic and very upsetting, so viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and steal the glass plate inside of their microwave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In the early 1950s, Harold Alexander, who was a young stonemason living in Hamburg, Germany, came in contact with an old man named George Reel. George was the leader of a small religious group called the Lorber Society. This group, which never had a large membership at any point in their short history, was rooted in the Christian faith, but their views were far more extreme than the average Christian congregation. For example, many Christians believe in the concept of self-denial, which in layman's terms means to deny oneself some personal human pleasures, like certain sexual practices or the overindulgence of food or drinking, and all of this is done to gain favor with God. But George and the other members of the Lorber Society took this concept of self-denial to the extreme. They practiced it so aggressively and so literally that nobody in the society could really have a life of their own. All they could do to adhere to their society's these very strict rules was to worship God 24/7. In addition to their very severe lifestyles, members of the Lorber Society also believed that anybody outside of their small society was basically evil. So Harold meets George. It's unclear exactly how he meets George, but he does, and immediately Harold is blown away by George. He thinks he's totally incredible, he's so charismatic, and apparently George felt equally highly about Harold. And so right away they have this friendship, they strike up, and Harold and his wife Drogma, they end up joining the Lorber Society, and they completely give themselves over to this very intense lifestyle, and they listen to everything George tells them to do. And then very quickly after Harold and his wife had joined this society, their leader, George, became very ill, and it became clear he was going to die soon. When George was on his deathbed, Harold went to visit him, and after speaking with him privately in this room, Harold emerges and he tells his wife that George has told him that he is going to be the next leader of the Lorber Society once George passes away. And so his wife accepts this, as does the rest of the society members, and then after George actually does die, everyone in the society just turns towards Harold and begins listening to him and following him. It's worth noting that we don't know for sure if George really did tell Harold that he was going to be the next leader of the Lorber Society, or if Harold just made that up because he knew George was going to die soon and he could kind of get away with stealing that title. Over the next few years that Harold was in charge of the Lorber Society, he began introducing a new concept to the members. He would continuously tell them that they needed to be ready for when the next prophet of God returned to the earth. Harold told his members that when this happened, one, Harold would know immediately and he would tell them, and two, whatever this prophet wanted, no matter how confusing or crazy or terrible, they had to do it without question because this was God's will. In 1953, so roughly a year or two after Harold has taken over the Lorber Society, he and his wife, Drogma, have their second child. It's their first boy, and they name him Frank, and as soon as this child is born, Harold looks at him and determines that this boy, his son, is the prophet they have all been waiting for. And so he tells his wife and he tells the members of the Lorber Society that his son, Frank, is the prophet of God, and everyone across the board completely accepts it. As the prophet, Frank, grew up, he was shamelessly worshipped and waited on 24/7 by the members of the Lorber Society and his own family. And so naturally, this had a profound impact on the way Frank thought and how he behaved. By the time Frank was at the age of grade school children, he fully believed that he was the prophet of God, and he began using that authority to kind of boss his family around more than he really needed to, especially his three sisters and his mother. But no one ever intervened because, again, this is the prophet of God and he can do whatever he wants. When Frank turned 16, he started thinking about girls and sex, but he was conflicted because he had been taught everybody outside of this society he was a part of were evil. And so he didn't want to pollute himself by having sex with these evil women. And so he went to his father and told him that he wants to start having sex with his mother and his sisters in order to stay pure. And his father, Harold, not only embraced the idea, he encouraged it. And in fact, he would often join in with his son during the sexual intercourse. As for the four Alexander women, they completely accepted their new roles as sexual objects because they believed by doing whatever Frank the prophet wanted, they were serving God. Eventually, one of these sisters began talking to some of her very few friends at school about how she was kind of jealous of her other sisters for all the attention they were getting from Frank. And so the friends kind of picked up on this strange relationship between the siblings, and before long, rumors had started about there being some incestuous relations inside of this family, and those rumors eventually made their way to the parents of students, and then from the parents, that made its way to the police, and before long, Harold had discovered that the Hamburg police were about to launch an investigation into his family. And at the same time, Harold also discovered that members of the Lorber Society, they had heard about these incest rumors as well, and they had their own suspicions already, and they were not on board with incest. And so they were very clearly starting to distance themselves from Harold and his family. And so it was pretty clear to Harold that the writing was on the wall. He and his family were no longer welcome in Hamburg. And so he goes to the Lorber Society and kind of retires and says, I'm leaving. You need to find yourself a new leader of this society. And then he and his family completely broke ties with the Lorber Society. They left Hamburg and and fled south to Santa Cruz, which is a city on the Canary Islands in Spain. And so they settle into this little apartment inside of this busy city, and very quickly they fell back into their old routines of constantly worshiping Frank, the prophet of God, despite the fact that they were no longer affiliated with the Lorber Society. And so their actions were now being driven by their own personal belief system. 10 months later, on December 22nd, 1970, a wealthy doctor named Walter Trankler was at his villa, which was located not far from where the Alexanders lived, when he heard a knock at his front door. When he opened the front door, he saw there were these two men who he didn't recognize, who were covered head to toe in what looked like mud. And at first, he was totally taken aback by their appearance and almost wanted to just shut the door. But in order to be polite, he kept the door slightly open and said, hey, how can I help you guys? And the two men would introduce themselves as Harold and Frank Alexander, and they were there to speak with one of their family members, Sabine. Sabine was one of Frank's two younger sisters, and she worked for the doctor as a housemaid. And so the doctor, he didn't know any of Sabine's family members, so he just kind of took their request at face value and said, hold on, let me go get her. And so he leaves the front door, he goes into the kitchen, and he finds Sabine, this 15-year-old girl, and he tells her that your father and your brother are waiting for you outside. They want to talk to you. And so Sabine, without saying a word, puts her knife and the food down. She walks out of the kitchen with the doctor, and as they're walking towards the front door, the doctor stops about 10 or 15 feet away from the front door to kind of allow Sabine to walk up and have a semi-private conversation with her relatives, although they're still inside of his house, so he didn't want to go too far. And so the doctor is standing maybe 15 feet away, wondering if he should just turn around or maybe just go into the other room to let them speak, when he overhears the father, Harold, say something truly horrific to his daughter. It was so shocking that the doctor stopped what he was doing, turned, and looked directly at Sabine to see how she was going to react to what she just heard. But to the doctor's absolute shock, Sabine didn't break down and start crying or start screaming out in pain or anguish. Instead, she reached out and grabbed her father's muddy hand and pressed it to her cheek and said, "I'm sure you did what was necessary." And then the two embraced. The doctor stood there totally shocked, staring at these people, wondering what the heck they're doing. Why are they here? What are they talking about? Is this really happening? And then he just kind of blurts out, "Hey, I'll be right back. Stay right there." And then the doctor turned around and darted out of the front hall into another room where he barricaded himself inside, and then he called the police. When the police showed up just a few minutes later, they rolled into the front lot and they saw Harold, Frank, and Sabine were still just casually standing in the front doorway of the doctor's villa, seemingly not really trying to go anywhere or do anything. And so the police get out of their car, they walk up to the trio and they say, what's going on? What are you doing here? And Harold very calmly and casually tells one of the officers the same horrible thing that the doctor overheard him saying to Sabine. Except this time, Harold specified to the officers where this horrible thing took place. He said it happened inside of their apartment. The police were shocked at Harold's candidness and the fact that his two kids were standing right next to him and they're hearing what their father is saying. They too are just totally detached and very calm, as if nothing their father is saying is having any effect on them. It's just totally business as usual. And so the police asked Harold to repeat the story a few times to make sure they were hearing him correctly, and then they just arrested Harold and his two kids. After the three Alexanders were brought to the police station, 3 other police officers were sent over to the Alexanders' apartment in Santa Cruz to see if what Harold had said was actually true. And when these officers opened the front door to that apartment, they immediately could tell it was all true. The following is the story of what happened inside of that apartment based on the testimony given by Frank and Harold. On December 21st, 1970, so that's one day before Frank and Harold arrived on the doorstep of the doctor's villa, the father and son were home in their apartment with the mother, Dragma, as well as 2 of the 3 sisters. It was 18-year-old Marina and 15-year-old Petra. The other sister, Sabine, she was over at the doctor's villa. She was staying with him for a couple of days while she worked there. At some point that afternoon, Dragma and Harold left the living room and went into one of the bedrooms to lie down and take a nap. And after they lie down, Frank, for some reason, gets up from the living room and walks into the bedroom and sits down on the edge of the bed and just stares down at his mother. And when his mother rolls over and looks up at her son, Frank would later tell police that the look she gave him was suggestive and it was offensive to Frank, and he believed she was not permitted to look at him that way. And so in this moment that she's looking at him, he said he instinctively knew that the killing hour was upon them. The killing hour was not a Lorber Society concept. It was something that Frank and most likely Harold had come up with, and the rest of the family, the mother and the three sisters, had totally accepted. According to Frank and Harold, women were impure, and the only way to purify them, i.e. send them to heaven and not hell, was to murder them. And so it was just fundamentally understood in the Alexander household that at some point, Frank was going to declare that the killing hour was upon them. And when that happened, all the women in the household were told to stop what they were doing and wait for Frank to sacrifice them. Meaning, wait for Frank to ritualistically kill them. So after Frank has seen this offensive look on his mother's face, he now feels like the killing hour is upon them, and so he literally announces it to his mother and to his father, who's right next to her, and then Frank grabs a nearby wooden coat hanger and strikes his mother on the top of her head. Now, his mother, she's heard that the killing hour is upon them, and he's starting to beat her, and so what does she do? She follows the rules. She flips herself over onto her stomach, puts her hands down by her side, and lays flat and still so Frank can more easily kill her. And so Frank begins wailing on the back of his mother's head with this wooden coat hanger, while his father, Harold, excitedly leaps out of the bed, doesn't try to stop what's going on. He runs into the living room, and he begins very enthusiastically playing the organ. An organ is like a piano that's played a lot of times inside of Christian churches. And so with all this commotion going on in the house, the other two sisters that were there, Marina and Petra, they come out of their bedrooms into the living room. They see their father playing the organ, and they look into the bedroom where they hear all this noise, and it's Frank murdering their mother. And they're looking at this happening. They're not doing anything. They're just staring at it. And then their father says to them, "The killing hour is upon us. You need to get ready." And so the girls, when they hear this, they know the rules. And so they stop watching this attack, and they make their way over to the center of the living room, and they sit down cross-legged, and they begin to patiently wait their turn. After a while, Frank stopped beating his mother, who was now unconscious or perhaps even dead, and he walked out of the bedroom into the living room, where he saw his father on the organ, and he saw his two sisters sitting on the ground. And so without any hesitation, he walks over to Marina, the older one, the 18-year-old, and he begins hitting her on the top of the head until she slouches over onto the ground motionless. And then he turns to the younger one, Petra, the 15-year-old, and he does the same thing to her until she's laying on the ground motionless. After this, Frank stands up and he leaves the living room and goes into the kitchen, where he retrieves a small knife, pruning shears, and a hammer. At this point, it's likely that one or two of the Alexander women were still alive. And so Frank, he comes back into the living room with these tools in hand, and with the organs blaring in the background, he begins to systematically hack off the breasts and genitals of his two sisters and his mother. And apparently this was a very slow and physically difficult task, and so he and his father Harold began switching off. One person would be on the organs while the other was mutilating, and they would switch back and forth until all of the offending parts on these three women had been removed and nailed to the wall. The last mutilation this father and son committed was to cut the heart out of the mother, Dragma, and they wrapped it up in a cord and then nailed this cord to the wall as well. Then, with the three Alexander women either dead or close to death, the father and son began running around the apartment, yelling and singing and rejoicing. They were extremely proud of what they had just done. Later that night, they left the apartment and slept in another property that they owned, and then the following day, December 22nd, they went to the doctor's villa to tell Sabine the good news. And so they knock on the door, the doctor answers, he goes back, he gets Sabine. Sabine walks up, and Harold, her father, says to her, "Sabine, we wanted to tell you right away that Frank and I have just finished killing your mother and your sisters." To which Sabine walks up to him, takes her father's hand, presses it to her cheek, and says, "I'm sure you did what was necessary." This, of course, is what the doctor saw and overheard that was so horrible and prompted him to call the police. It was also the moment when he realized that was not mud all over these two men. That was their family members' blood. Psychiatrists would ultimately determine that Frank and Harold were not mentally fit to stand trial, and so they were both committed to an asylum for the criminally insane. Both men never showed any remorse or regret about what they had done. In fact, they continued to justify their actions by saying, because of them, these three women got to go to heaven. As for the one surviving daughter, Sabine, she pleaded with authorities to let her go live with her brother and her father in this asylum, but they rejected this request and sent her to live in a convent, which is a building that nuns live in, and no one really knows what happened to her after that. Shockingly, in 1990, so roughly 20 years after Frank and Harold were put into this asylum, they managed to escape, and they were never caught. To this day, their whereabouts remain unknown. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please sneak into the like button's house and steal the glass plate inside of their microwave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and mugs and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions about our shop, go to our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's johnballen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called MrBallen where we post condensed versions of the longer episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. In the early morning hours of April 27th, 2006, a phone rang inside of a home in rural Michigan. When the homeowner answered it, what they would hear would instantly ruin their lives. But that phone call was nothing compared to the call they got 5 weeks later. This story has one of the most insane plot twists we've ever covered on this channel, so make sure you stick around to the end to hear what it is. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come on over your house for a sleepover, but then give them a bed without pillows or blankets. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On Wednesday, April 26, 2006, a bright, beautiful, outgoing 18-year-old named Whitney Sarek began making her way across her campus towards her lecture hall where she had a class that morning. Whitney was a freshman at Taylor University, which is an evangelical Christian liberal arts college located in Upland, Indiana. Upland is a little town that sits about 2 miles east of Interstate 69 and is situated right between the two much larger cities of Indianapolis and Fort Wayne. As Whitney made her way along the pathway across campus and she passed by other throngs of students hustling to their own classes, she suddenly had a pang of anxiety as she realized the end of the school year was fast approaching. And while Whitney was definitely excited to head back home to rural Gaylord, Michigan, where she was from, to spend her summer vacation, she was also kind of bummed because she would have to say bye to all of her new friends in college that she wouldn't see again until after summer break in the fall when the next school year started. Whitney had made a ton of friends over the course of her freshman year, and by and large they were other freshmen like herself. But she did have a few friends that were upperclassmen, because early in Whitney's collegiate career, she had discovered that upperclassmen were just as friendly as freshmen, and they came with the bonus of lots of experience and expertise, and if you just asked them for guidance or advice, they'd be happy to give it to you. And so over the course of the school year, anytime Whitney had an opportunity to interact with or be around upperclassmen, she would take it, thinking, maybe I can learn something. And in fact, that morning, as Whitney was making her way across campus, she saw a sign that was asking for students to volunteer to the next day head out to this banquet hall to set up this big banquet for the school's new incoming president. And so when Whitney walked over to the table and asked the people what this was all about, she would learn that the majority of the people that had signed up to be volunteers so far were upperclassmen. And so as soon as she heard that, Whitney was quick to write her name down as well. The rest of the day would go completely as normal for Whitney. She would go to her classes, she would study, she would meet up with friends, and then eventually in the evening, she would make her way back to her dorm room where she would go to sleep. Little did she know, when she put her head down on the pillow that night, she was within 24 hours of her life changing in the most drastic way imaginable. The following morning, Whitney got up early, she took a shower, she brushed her teeth, and then she spent quite a while just staring at her wardrobe, debating which outfit she was going to wear, and then finally she chose the one she wanted and she got dressed. Whitney was not vain, but she knew the whole day would be spent around upperclassmen and university staff, and so she wanted to look her best. On her way towards her door to leave, Whitney would stop and look in her mirror one last time to make sure she looked okay, and in this fleeting moment, as she's looking herself up and down, she couldn't help but feel a justifiable sense of pride in this woman looking back at her. She had gotten into a great college, she had moved hundreds of miles from home and lived alone by herself for the first time, and her grades all year had been excellent. And so as Whitney's looking at herself, she thought to herself, you know what? I'm doing pretty good. Whitney's gaze would move from her reflection up to the clock on the wall, and she would see she was running late. And so she quickly grabbed her jacket, she threw it over her shoulder, and she went out the door. When Whitney arrived at the meeting spot in the parking lot nearby, she saw there was a group of what looked like students standing around a university van. And so Whitney walked up to them, and sure enough, this was the group of volunteers. It consisted of 7 other Taylor students, most of which were seniors, and 1 university staff member. And so Whitney didn't know any of them, and so she quickly introduced herself, everyone said hi, and then because Whitney was the last person they were waiting on, very quickly after she arrived, they were kind of ushered into the van, and then the van pulled out of the parking lot and began heading north towards Fort Wayne. Fort Wayne was where the banquet hall was. It was located about an hour north. At some point during this drive north, Whitney struck up a conversation with a 22-year-old senior named Laura Van Ryn, who was sitting right next to her. Whitney and Laura were total strangers, but they looked so similar physically. They were both tall, blonde, and very slim, that when they first got onto the van, one of the other volunteers actually asked them if they were related. But it wasn't just physical similarities that Laura and Whitney shared. Once they got to talking, Whitney would learn that Laura had also grown up in a small rural Michigan town. It was called Caledonia, and it was located only a couple of hours south of Gaylord, where Whitney had grown up. After the van finally arrived in Fort Wayne, the volunteers got out, they went inside of the banquet hall building, and for the next several hours, they set up tables and chairs, they put out silverware, they hung up decorations, and the whole time, Laura and Whitney just stayed close together, continuing their friendly banter. And then around 7 p.m., when the banquet hall was ready for the next day's ceremony, the volunteers decided their work was done, and so they left the banquet hall building, they piled back into the van, and began heading south back towards their campus. For the first few minutes of the ride, Laura and Whitney would just continue to chat with each other, but pretty quickly they, like the rest of the people in the volunteer group, just were tired from all the hard work of moving things around, and so they became quiet and began looking out the window, just kind of keeping to themselves. About 30 minutes later, when the van was within a couple of miles of their campus, Whitney would turn and look next to her at Laura just for a second, and right as she did, Laura would actually look up and look at Whitney. And so for a really quick second, they made eye contact, and so Whitney kind of awkwardly smiled at her, and as Laura was smiling back at Whitney, Whitney realized something very strange. There was this bright light on the side of Laura's face. And then seconds later, that bright light had grown and the entire interior of the van was completely whited out. And then a second later, someone towards the front of the van yelled, "Oh my God, no!" And then the van went completely silent. Today's video is sponsored by NordVPN. You ever find yourself in Chocolaco, Alabama, looking out at a fresh murder of crows, and you think to yourself, man, I should get those crows some light fall weather jackets. And so you run home, you fire up your gasoline-powered computer, you hop online to start searching for the perfect crow jacket, and then you get hit with a PUA, a pop-up ad. And you throw your hands out to protect yourself, you're hit with another PUA, and before long you're on the ground, you're calling out for your crow friends to come save you, but they're so chilly without their jackets, they can't flap their wings fast enough to get to you, and so scared and alone on the ground, you die. This used to happen to me 5, 10, 60 times a week until I discovered NordVPN. A VPN, or virtual private network, keeps you safe while you browse the internet. And NordVPN is the brand name in the space. Not only will NordVPN ensure your data stays safely behind their next generation wall of encryption, but also, most importantly, through their latest feature called Threat Protection, they will automatically block those death-inducing pop-up ads. So, if you want to slightly warm up a pack of crows in Chocolaco, Alabama, and you want to live, sign up for NordVPN today. And right now, the best deal available for NordVPN is through my YouTube offer. Right now, NordVPN is offering viewers an exclusive 2-year plan at a huge discount, plus 4 additional months for free when you go to nordvpn.com/MrBallen. And it's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. Again, go to nordvpn.com/MrBallen or click the link in the description. Okay, back to the story. Within minutes, dozens of 911 calls were coming in from motorists on I-69 saying that something terrible had happened. When first responders arrived on scene, they were braced for the worst, but even still, they were shocked at what they saw. Scattered all over the northbound and southbound lanes of I-69, not far from Taylor University, were all these huge chunks of jagged metal, there was glass everywhere, and there were bodies everywhere. That light that Whitney saw growing on Laura's face that suddenly filled the entirety of the van were the headlights of an 80,000-pound, fully loaded tractor-trailer truck driven by Robert Spencer. Robert was a truck driver, and he was traveling north on I-69 when he fell asleep at the wheel, at which point his truck veered off the road into the grassy median between the northbound side and the southbound side of I-69. His truck bounced up onto the southbound lane and crashed into Laura and Whitney's van, and when it did, the impact literally peeled off the side of their van and sent the van spinning. And so as the van is spinning, because of this huge opening in the side of it, the students inside were literally being violently thrown out of the van into traffic. When first responders finally actually began surveying the crash site, they would find Robert still in his truck, he was alive, but they would discover that of the 9 occupants inside of that van, 5 were deceased. A few hours later, in the early morning hours of April 27th, Whitney Sarik's family, back home in Gaylord, Michigan, woke up to the sound of a phone ringing. When one of Whitney's parents answered the phone, it was the Grant County coroner telling them their daughter had been in a terrible accident and she was deceased. At the same time, 3 hours south of Gaylord, Michigan, in Caledonia, Michigan, the Van Ryn family also was woken up in the middle of the night to a phone call, except the call they got was that their daughter Laura had been in that same crash, but she had survived, although she was in critical condition. In the days that followed, the Sarik family had Whitney's body transported to Gaylord, and then they began to plan for her funeral. A funeral that would have to be closed casket because of the extensive damage to Whitney's body. Meanwhile, Laura Van Ryn's family rushed to Parkview Hospital in Fort Wayne, and they would find their daughter bandaged head to toe with a neck brace on, laying in a hospital bed in a coma. Doctors would tell Laura's family that even though Laura was now stable, there was no way of knowing if she would ever come out of that coma. And even if she did, she had suffered a serious brain injury, which likely would impact her ability to function. And so knowing that at best, this was going to be a very long road to recovery, Laura's family decided to move her from Fort Wayne back home to Michigan to a rehabilitation center in Grand Rapids that specialized in brain injury. And so while the Van Ryns were in the process of moving Laura back to Michigan, the Sariks were in the process of saying their final goodbyes to Whitney. On April 29th, so 3 days after the accident, the Sareks would hold a visitation in their hometown of Gaylord. A visitation is a time for friends and acquaintances to come together and pay respects and offer condolences to the people that the deceased have left behind. For Whitney's visitation, more than 1,400 people attended, which was nearly half of Gaylord's total population. The following day, on April 30th, Whitney was buried. At the same time, Laura's family, who had been taking turns keeping a 24-hour bedside vigil with Laura in the Grand Rapids facility, were given some incredible news. Based on brain scans, it looked very much like Laura would wake up from her coma, although there was no timeline. Over the next couple of weeks, Laura remained comatose, but her body would slowly begin to heal, and all signs seemed to be pointing towards her eventually making a recovery. And then on Tuesday, May 16th, so 20 days after the accident, Laura woke up from her coma. And amazingly, at first, it seemed like her brain was functioning the way it should be. The family could not believe their luck. This was a miracle. Over the next few days, Laura would slowly regain her strength to the point where she could move some limbs and she could sit up in her bed. And then as for her cognitive function, it seemed like she was making strides, but then she would do something that would make doctors and her family and everybody around her start to question if her brain really was okay. On Monday, May 22nd, so 1 week after Laura had woken up from her coma, she was sitting in her hospital bed with her physical therapist right next to her, and her family was in the room as well. And at some point, her physical therapist handed Laura a pencil, and then she put a pad of paper in front of her. And then the therapist told Laura to write a word down that was very specific. It was a word that Laura should know well, and a word that Laura should be able to spell. And so after Laura kind of gave a nod, saying she understood the assignment, Laura took the pencil and very awkwardly and painstakingly wrote out a word. But when she was done, and the therapist looked at what she had written, it was wrong. It didn't make any sense. And so she asked Laura to do it again. And so Laura, with even more determination, would try to write this word. And once again, she wrote the same word, the same incorrect word. And so it was at this point that the therapist and the onlooking family started to realize that, her injury to her brain might be more extensive than we thought. However, as everyone in that room would soon find out, that was not the case. There was something much, much bigger going on. Back on April 26th, just minutes after the car accident, first responders began moving about the crash site to figure out who was deceased and who was still alive. When they found Laura, she was barely clinging to life on the side of the road, and so they rushed over to her. They put her on a stretcher along with her purse, which contained her driver's license. They put that all together, they put her on an ambulance, and they sent her to the hospital. Once Laura arrived at the hospital, doctors would use her driver's license inside of her purse to identify her, and then they began wrapping her head to toe in bandages and casts. And when bandages began coming off over the following weeks, it was immediately obvious to everyone that this accident had significantly altered Laura's physical appearance, most notably her teeth. They almost looked like they had been shifted to one side in her mouth. However, to Laura's family, they didn't care how she looked. They only cared that she was still alive. But on Monday, May 22nd, when Laura was handed that piece of paper and a pencil, and she was told to write her name, she did not write Laura, Laura. She wrote Whitney. Whitney. It would turn out a colossal mistake was made, and nobody caught it until that moment. The woman sitting in the hospital bed with the pencil and paper was not 22-year-old Laura Van Ryn. The woman sitting in the hospital bed was 18-year-old Whitney Sarek. When Whitney was found on the side of the road clinging to life, the first responders thought the purse next to her was hers, and so they opened it up, they found a driver's license, they looked at it, and they looked at the victim on the ground, and they looked identical, and so they said, okay, this is Laura. And amazingly, Whitney's purse that contained her driver's license happened to land on the ground next to Laura's body, and so Laura was misidentified as Whitney Sarek. A week after Whitney had written her name down on that pad of paper, it was officially confirmed that this was a case of mistaken identity. And so once again, the Sarek family received a call in the middle of the night from the Grant County coroner. Except this time, they were telling them that your daughter did not die in that car accident. She's alive. She's in Grand Rapids waiting for you. And so the Sarek family, they were completely shocked. They wanted this to be true, but it just seemed too good to be true. They had had a funeral for Whitney. They had buried Whitney. Except because it was closed casket, they never saw Whitney. And so the Sareks hopped on a plane, they flew to Grand Rapids, and they walked into that hospital room, and there on the hospital bed was their daughter Whitney with her arms outstretched, crying, calling for her parents. Well, this, of course, was a miracle for the Sareks. It was, at the same time, a complete nightmare for the Van Rins. They had had their suspicions that something was off about their daughter, most notably her teeth, because they just didn't look like their daughter's teeth. But they had been told by the doctors and by anybody who would talk to them that it was perfectly normal for people involved in these very significant accidents to look completely different or even act completely different. And so the Van Rins just kind of put their suspicions to the side and focused on looking after their child and helping her recover. A few days later, Laura Van Rin's body, which had been buried in Gaylord, Michigan under the tombstone that said Whitney Sarek, was exhumed and her body was flown to Caledonia, where the Van Ryn family was able to give their daughter a proper funeral and burial. Even though Whitney and Laura had only known each other very briefly during that volunteer event in Fort Wayne, their families would forge a bond over this shared trauma. And in 2008, 2 years after the crash, the Sareks and the Van Rins would co-author a book about their experience in going through this horrible event from each of their perspectives. That book is called Mistaken Identity: Two Families, One Survivor, Unwavering Hope. Also that year, on April 26th, so the second anniversary of the accident, Taylor University would dedicate a prayer chapel to the 5 victims. Since the crash, Indiana has changed their state's protocols and procedures for identifying accident victims to ensure this type of mix-up can never happen again. As for Robert Spencer, the truck driver who caused the fatal accident, he would be sentenced to 4 years in prison. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the like button to come over to your house for a sleepover, but then give them a bed with no pillows or blankets. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We now have a podcast called the MrBallen Podcast that puts out brand new, never before heard stories on Mondays, and we put out remasters of our best YouTube audios on Thursdays. And so again, the podcast is called MrBallen Podcast, and it's available on YouTube, on Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Google, basically anywhere you find your podcasts, you can find this one. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation, which makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crime. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We also have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is called MrBallen Shorts. The other is called MrBallen en Español. We also put out near daily content on Facebook and Snapchat. Both of those pages are just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then just send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. We have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. And if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today's stories are about how sometimes doing what you think is the right thing can actually be the most dangerous choice you can make. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you're walking into a building and the like button's right behind you, obviously following you, make sure to turn around, make eye contact, and then shut the door. Don't hold it for them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On a Saturday afternoon in February of 2011, 18-year-old Michael Peary was 1,000 feet underground, crouched inside of a dark cave in Lafayette, Georgia, along with 4 of his friends. As Michael looked around, his headlamp beam bounced off all the low-hanging rocks and underground waterfalls and deep crevices, and it all just kind of felt like some kind of dark and otherworldly planet down here. So this cave that they were in was a famous cave called Ellison, and Michael and his friends had driven over 400 miles from their college town in Gainesville to see it. Ellison was almost 12 miles of tunnels and shafts and crevices, and thousands of cavers went through it every year. It was very popular. Now, to be clear, caving as an activity was not really Michael's thing. He was a marketing major at the University of Florida, and he mostly considered himself to be a pretty quiet person and liked studying or playing in his school band or volunteering with his church youth group. And so crawling through a tiny, pitch black, very claustrophobic hole hundreds of feet underground was not really his first choice for fun. But Michael was not there today for fun. He was there because his close friend, a guy named Grant Lockenbach, had suggested it. So he had said, okay, I'll go with you. Just now, Michael looked over to where Grant was sitting with his girlfriend, whose name was Carrie, and also they were sitting with 2 of their other friends. And the group of them were all looking through a backpack and sort of taking stock of the various pieces of gear that they had brought along with them. Now, they'd only entered Ellison just a few minutes ago, but already the group had stopped because there was something in this area that Grant really wanted to see. And when Grant wanted to do something, it usually happened. Hence why Michael capitulated and wound up in this cave, because Grant wanted him to. And so, like normal, he went along with it. So Grant, he was the president of their school's Fellowship of Christian Athletes, which Michael, Carrie, and the other 2 friends were also members of. And when Michael had joined the fellowship, Grant had sort of taken him under his wing and told Michael that he had tons of potential. In fact, he said Michael had enough potential to be the next president of the fellowship. And this had given Michael a ton of confidence because he really looked up to Grant. I mean, a lot of people did. Grant was just cool. He was a few years older than Michael and was basically like a 6-foot-tall ball of positive energy who was always looking for some adventure to go off and do. Grant had been exploring caves as a hobby for the last 3 years, and he was actually really the only member of their group with any real caving experience. And it was actually this lack of experience amongst the other people that were with Grant, including Michael, that was the reason they were going through an easier tunnel within Ellison that was basically a straight shot through the mountain and did not require much gear like rope or climbing equipment. It was like very beginner. But despite that, despite the low level of difficulty of the caving route they had chosen, they'd brought that stuff anyway, all that extra equipment, because along this easier route, at the place where they were now stopped, was the entrance to a vertical shaft that Grant specifically wanted to climb down, even if he went alone. This shaft was 125 feet deep. So think of like a 10-story building. That is how deep this pit went. But it was actually called the warm-up pit because compared to the other, deep pits in Ellison, it was nothing. Some were way deeper, like over 500 feet. So this was definitely not beginner. This was an advanced thing to be doing, so Grant was going to do it. But again, it's sort of a novice level, more advanced thing to be doing in this cave. Now, Michael watched Grant take the backpack with all the equipment in it over to this pit's entrance, which was basically just a very large hole in the ground that was over near this waterfall, and it was only about a few feet away from Michael. And so Michael walked over to Grant to help set him up, which involved attaching a climbing rope to the rocks that Grant could then use to lower himself into this pit with. This process is called rigging, and it took them a while since really Michael had to wait for Grant to instruct him on every step, because Michael, again, is not an experienced caver at all. But as Michael worked with Grant to get him all rigged up,
he found himself peering into the pitch black hole, and as he looked down into what just felt like this bottomless abyss, he felt his stomach kind of flip. He was glad he had not promised Grant that he would go into the pit too, because, seeing it now up close in person, this was terrifying. He did not want to go into this thing. But Grant clearly did. He was excited. And so Michael and Grant continued to get Grant all set up, and then eventually, finally, when Grant was rigged, Michael heard the sound of something pretty heavy sliding off of a rock, and then moments later there was this loud, echoing thud from deep inside of this hole, the warm-up pit. For a moment, Michael was just confused. He didn't know what the sound was. Maybe it was a rock falling into the pit. But he looked over at Grant, and Grant had a very unhappy expression, and he was looking at the ground right next to the pit hole, and that was where their backpack had been, with all the equipment inside of it, at least the equipment that they weren't using, and the backpack was not there anymore. The backpack had just fallen 125 feet down into this pit. Now, obviously, this was not good. They did not want their backpack in this hole, but it was actually worse than just losing their equipment potentially, because in that bag was their only cell phone that they had brought with them. And it was also where they had put all their ropes and other climbing gear. They'd taken some stuff out, to get Grant rigged up here, but still, losing this bag felt really bad. Without its contents, they could easily get stranded or trapped inside of this cave, and they wouldn't be able to call or text anybody. They'd be stuck. And so Michael could actually feel himself starting to panic, but then Grant cut in and played it cool as always, and he said, look, it's no big deal. He would just go down there and he would get it. He was going into the hole anyway, and he was rigged up after all, so he would just go down and retrieve the bag. It would be fine. And then before Michael or, Grant's girlfriend or the other friends could say anything, Grant just, strapped on his harness and a pair of ascenders, which were climbing tools that would help him move down the rope in a controlled way, and he began sort of positioning himself to go down into this pit. And Michael just watched Grant in complete awe. Grant was so confident that he was able to basically make everybody else around him feel calm too. And Michael felt himself calming down just watching Grant. And this was not the only time that Grant had projected calm in the face of danger. During Grant's freshman year, he'd casually climbed up the exterior of one of their school's dormitories just to see if he could do it. And he did do it. And he also had joined the school's ROTC, which is a military reserve training program, and learned how to jump out of planes. So he had skydived, sort of a thrill-seeking activity. And so this moment in the cave seemed like yet another example of why Grant was really such an incredible leader. And Michael found himself hoping that by the time he potentially took over as president of the fellowship, that he could be just as fearless as Grant. But for now, Michael watched as Grant very calmly lowered himself into the hole and then disappeared into the abyss below. And for the next few minutes, it was very quiet, and all Michael could hear was the sound of the waterfall. So he and Carrie and the others just sort of talked amongst themselves and waited for Grant to call back up that he was down there and had successfully grabbed the backpack. And finally, they did hear Grant, and he did call out from somewhere down in the hole. But Michael couldn't really understand what Grant was saying because the waterfall that was kind of blasting nearby was really loud, and also Grant's voice echoed around the cave, which made it hard to tell what he was saying. So at this point, Michael and Carrie and the others were not worried. They figured that this was just an acoustics problem, not a safety problem. So Michael just walked over to the edge of this pit and kind of leaned over and just looked down. But, he couldn't see Grant. He was too far down and it was too dark. And so Michael called out, asking Grant to repeat himself because they couldn't understand what he was saying. And Grant did yell back. He clearly replied to Michael, but Michael still couldn't really make out what he was saying. However, this time, there was something really different about the way Grant sounded. Again, even though he doesn't know what Grant's saying, one thing was definitely clear. Grant no longer sounded like the calm, cool, and collected, fearless leader that he normally was. He was talking really fast, he was repeating himself, he was saying something really, really quickly, very urgently. And even though, again, it wasn't clear what it was, the tone was very clear. Grant was scared. There was a problem. Now, obviously, problems arise when you are rappelling into a 125-foot hole underground in this cave. Problems can happen. But for Michael and the others, when they sort of realized that something was wrong for Grant, it was really shocking. Grant is the guy that got other people out of problems. He was the calm guy. Nothing rattled him. And so just to hear him basically panicking,
it was really unsettling for those at the surface. And so Michael and the others, they're kind of hit with this sudden realization that, one, it's very unsettling to hear Grant sounding this way, but worse, two, is they're not cavers. They can't go into this pit and save Grant if he needs saving. Not only because they lacked experience, but also all the caving, all the climbing equipment was in that backpack that fell into the pit that's down there with Grant. So there's no way they can realistically help him if he is in any sort of trouble down there. And also, their one cell phone is down in that backpack in the pit. And so unless Grant can figure out whatever problem he's got and get back up here on his own, Michael and the others, without even saying it, knew like they were kind of helpless. And so as this realization is setting in for Michael and the others, Grant goes from trying to talk to them, even though again, they can't tell what he's saying, he just sounds sort of panicked, to straight up screaming. He's screaming for them. Something is horribly wrong. And so Michael and Carrie, they start yelling down to Grant, trying to get him to clarify what's going on, but you have this waterfall that's causing all this noise and splashing everywhere. It's dark, and Grant clearly is so panicked that he's not even listening to them, and so it's chaos, it's madness. And so Michael and Carrie, they turn to the other two friends, and they say, look, we're going to stay here at this hole and wait for Grant. You two leave the cave, go get help. And so the other two, they rushed off to do just that, while Michael and Carrie just sat there listening to Grant getting more and more hysterical by the second, somewhere down in this hole. They still have no idea what's wrong, but clearly there is an emergency here. And so for a little while after the friends have gone off, Michael and Carrie, even though they're not really talking to Grant because he's just kind of rambling and yelling and screaming, they can't understand him, they're just kind of shouting down into the hole that everything's going to be okay, we've sent to get help, it's going to be okay, you're going to get out of here soon. They have no idea if he can hear them or understand them. They're assuming that the acoustics are bad down there too. Again, the sound of that waterfall is so loud, it's so dark. And so they're just like having this awful moment. But then what cut through all this chaos was at some point, Michael heard Grant say something that he really did understand. Grant, at some point, in a very high-pitched, almost screaming voice, yelled out Michael's name. Like he was directly yelling to Michael, like, I need you, Michael, to help me. Now, at this point, obviously the situation has escalated dramatically and already, like, things are bad. And for Michael, this felt like a big deal. Before that, all the yelling and screaming was obviously bad. But Michael, he kind of views himself as, Grant's successor, potentially. He's going to be the next, president of this fellowship. And he looked up to Grant so much, primarily because Grant was like this fearless leader. And so Michael sort of felt like when he heard his name called out, that Grant was specifically sort of challenging him, like, you, Michael, I need you. Michael took on that responsibility. And he felt like, I can't just sit here. I can't just wait. Something needs to be done, and I need to do it. I need to save Grant. And so Michael, he jumped up, and he grabbed the extra harness they still had, and he put it on. And as he was doing that, he could hear Carrie, who, she's seeing what's happening, and she's telling him, don't do it. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to go down this thing. Like, this is dangerous. Or what are you doing? Don't go. And Michael, he just looked at her and he said, I have to do this. I know Grant would do this for me. I'm doing it for him. He needs me. I'm going down. And Michael, he's listening to Carrie, still trying to tell him not to go, but he just said to her, please pray for me. And then he walked over and he attached his harness to the same rope that Grant presumably was still attached to down at the bottom, but stuck for some reason, and into the pit he went. As soon as Michael disappeared into this hole, Carrie knelt down beside the pit, she put her hands together, and she prayed as hard as she could for Michael and Grant to be okay. And after a few minutes, she heard Michael call out from somewhere in the hole. And for some reason, she could actually understand what Michael was saying, which was basically that he and Grant were okay. He was with Grant, but they were just very, very cold. Relief flooded over Carrie, and as she exhaled all the tension she'd been holding in, and as the adrenaline kind of began to leave her body, because now she's thinking everything's okay, she also realized that she too was very cold. She just hadn't been thinking about it. She was so fixated on the safety of her boyfriend and also Michael. After all, she was only wearing a t-shirt, and the cave was very damp, and there's this waterfall kind of spraying water everywhere. It was cold. It was a damp environment. And so she's, her teeth are chattering too. She's cold. And so Carrie naturally yelled down into this hole. She can't see them, of course. She's just yelling into the darkness, what's going on? What's wrong? Is Grant okay? But Michael just shouted back to her, I'm fine. but didn't answer her question about Grant. And at this, Carrie could tell clearly there's something really wrong down there, and it probably has to do with Grant. And so she stood up, she began pacing back and forth, her stomach's in knots, and she's periodically yelling down into the hole to Michael, like, what's going on? Is Grant okay? Are you okay? But Michael, all he would say back to her is, I'm fine. I'm fine. He would just say that back to her. But his response time began to slow down. He wasn't responding to each and every one of her calls. He would just, yell out, I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine. But it began to become more and more spaced out as Carrie began to ramp up her questioning, asking more and more what's going on, until finally Michael just stopped answering altogether. There were no more voices coming out of the hole. And so the minutes ticked by, and Carrie, she continued to pace around, yelling out to Michael and Grant, but the only reply she got was the sound of the water from the waterfall lapping up against the cave walls. About an hour and a half later, just before 4 p.m., a man named Anmar Mirza, along with 2 other men, ran into the Ellison Cave with a bag of climbing equipment and medical supplies. Now, there was a bigger team of rescue workers on their way up the mountain behind them that had more gear and more personnel, but that group was moving slowly because it took time to respond to a cave accident, because typically there were a lot of people and a lot of equipment, specialized equipment that was required, and also usually the victims were trapped in, pretty remote and difficult to access places, like tunnels and shafts deep inside of these caves. So Anmar and his team were the initial smaller group that went ahead of the larger one to just kind of get the rescue started. A few minutes after entering the cave, Anmar saw a headlamp beam up ahead in the darkness, kind of bobbing around. And as soon as he reached the origin of this light, he found a young woman who was sitting by a large hole, and she was shaking and terrified. She explained that her name was Carrie, and that her boyfriend, whose name was Grant, along with one of his friends, whose name was Michael, were down in this hole, and that Grant had gone in, there had been some issue, Michael had gone in after him, and now, when she called out for them, neither of them were responding. After hearing this, Anmar directed one of his team members to take Carrie and bring her out of the cave, and then once they had left, Anmar put on his climbing gear, and as soon as he was ready, he began to rappel down into this pit. As Anmar rappelled, he's looking straight down into this dark shaft, and at first he can't see anything. But after a little while, he began to see somewhere down below were what appeared to be 2 lights towards the bottom of this pit, which he assumed belonged to the 2 men. But before he could actually reach them, he felt something wet and freezing cold splash his cheek. Then he saw something emerge out of the darkness right below him. It would turn out, when Grant rappelled down into this warm-up pit, he had made a terrible, terrible mistake. He had attached his rig to a section of rock that was directly in the path of a freezing cold waterfall. Now, this alone could have been okay. You can rappel effectively through a waterfall if you're careful. Except what happened with Grant is, as he was rappelling literally through the water, like the water is coming off this waterfall, it's hitting him, he got stuck. His rope got tangled. And where he got stuck was literally in the path of the waterfall. So he's stuck in the cave, he can't go up, he can't go down, and he's just getting pounded by freezing cold water. Now, at first, what Grant likely did is kind of flail around to try to get out of the path of this water, but there was nowhere to go. He's in this shaft, there's nowhere to go, and he's just dangling there, and he began trying to scream out for help, but that was why his words were muffled, because the water was hitting him in the face, so he couldn't speak clearly. And then also, as he's just dangling there, very quickly, having that icy water hitting him nonstop would have actually sent his body into shock. And it's like he wouldn't have been able to speak or think anymore. I mean, he was becoming hypothermic. And then, in what was possibly one of his final moments of clarity, he managed to belt out Michael's name. And he said it really clearly, kind of managed to get his face out of the water for a second. And Michael, who trusted Grant completely when he heard his name being called, it felt like it was his calling. He needed to go in there and save Grant himself. And so into the hole he went, and he hooked his rope up into the same exact spot that Grant had, and down he went. And Michael, he did an incredibly brave thing by doing this. And it was something that Grant very likely would have done for him too. But again, Michael really had no idea what he was doing. He was basically just going in blind. However, unfortunately, because he just kind of followed Grant's lead and went down there without a plan, well, in the darkness, as he went down, he eventually reached where Grant was, but got stuck as well, also in the path of the waterfall. Granted, he was not nearly as exposed to the water as Grant was. Like, his face was not getting blasted by water, so he was able to call out and be heard by Carrie. But he also got tangled at the same spot, couldn't move, his body's getting hit by this icy water. And so even though the rescuers did eventually get down to Michael and Grant, by the time they did, it was too late. The two men had froze to death. They basically dangled inside of this hole, getting hit by this water for about 2 hours before their bodies just shut down. In 2013, 2 years after both Michael and Grant died inside of that cave, the Carnegie Hero Fund Commission gave Michael a posthumous medal for risking his life to save Grant's. On a Friday night in late March of 1980, an 83-year-old man named Harry R. Truman sat on his couch in his Washington State Lodge with a whiskey and Coke and turned on his battery-operated radio to listen to the news. And just a second or two later, he found himself having to jack up the volume of the radio because he couldn't hear it anymore because a couple of his cats in the other room were fighting and yowling, and it was causing a whole commotion. Harry had lost track of how many cats he actually had, but it was a lot, maybe a dozen. And even though at this moment he yelled and cursed at them and told them to knock it off, he was actually glad they were out there with him, because he liked their company. 5 years earlier, Harry's wife, Edna, had died, and since then, he had lived alone, minus all these cats. And he also didn't have a lot of neighbors either, so for the most part, he had been fairly isolated the last few years. Also, Spirit Lake, the lake that his lodge was on, was 4 hours south of the major city of Seattle, and pretty far into the wilderness. The lake did get busy in the summer with tourists, but at this time in March, there were only about 60 people that lived there, and they were very spread out. But Harry didn't really mind the solitude. He missed Edna a lot, but he had his cats, and he had his radio, and the jaw-dropping mountain scenery and lake, and he had his whiskey and Cokes. So overall, even though he was sort of a gruff guy, he was actually quite happy with his life. But just then, there was a loud knock on Harry's door. And Harry was not surprised by this. I mean, yes, he lives way out in the middle of nowhere, and he did not expect visitors, but in this case, he knew who it was. And as soon as he thought about that, his face contorted into a scowl. He was really annoyed. At this point in Harry's life, he really had only one problem. And it was a major problem, at least to him. And that was the government. And for the last few days, government agents, like almost certainly the ones that were knocking on his door, had been harassing him, trying to get him to leave his lodge in the wilderness that he loves so much, because they needed to conduct some kind of federal operation and they wanted everybody to clear out. Now, Harry loved his country and he'd even fought for it during the First World War, but he really did not like authority and he could not tolerate being told what to do. During Prohibition, for example, which was a period of time in the 1920s when alcohol was illegal in America, Harry had simply ignored the law and made his own booze, like he just didn't care. So, over these last few days that these federal agents had come to his house trying to get him to leave, Harry had not been intimidated, he had simply stood his ground. And he figured it was really only a matter of time before the federal government sent a local police officer over in hopes that Harry would be more cooperative with somebody that he likely already knew. But what they didn't know about Harry is that Harry really didn't cooperate with anybody. Not with the government, certainly, not with local police, not with his own family, not with his friends, or not with the two ex-wives he'd been with before finding Edna. He was just somebody who marched to the beat of his own drum. So now, Harry did not get up to answer the knock at his door. Instead, he just waited until the person out there, the visitor, yelled through the door and announced who they were, and not really to Harry's surprise, it was the local deputy that Harry did know, clearly being sent here by the federal agents to try to get Harry to leave. And when Harry still didn't answer the door when the deputy clearly had announced themselves, knowing Harry would know who they were, when Harry still didn't get up, didn't answer the door, the deputy finally, just sort of frustrated, called out, "Harry, are you sure you don't want to go?" Now, even though this deputy was being a whole lot more amicable than the government agents had been, they had been really forceful, basically telling him you gotta leave, the deputy here was at least kind of giving Harry a chance to make a decision. Despite that, the question the deputy had asked just made Harry really mad, because leaving his house was just not something he would ever consider doing. Harry had lived in this lodge for 54 years, and 37 of those years were spent running this lodge as an inn, as a business, with his late wife Edna, who was the love of his life. Now, he'd let the lodge go a little after she had died, so truthfully it was kind of falling apart and it smelled terrible, because of all the cats. But it had been theirs, and now it was his, and he would never give it up. And not only that, but just outside his doorstep was Spirit Lake, which Harry believed was the most beautiful, perfect place in the entire world. It was quiet and serene and situated right at the base of some of the most breathtaking mountains he had ever seen in his whole life. And so to say Harry loved it here was a complete understatement. His lodge and Spirit Lake were basically his whole identity. Harry didn't know if he believed in God, but he did believe in the trees and the lake and the birds that screeched at him at all hours of the day. It was like his home, this area, was his religion. And he certainly was not about to give it up just because some federal authority or government agent or whoever told him to. So all Harry said to the deputy waiting outside was a very firm "good night," which Harry was actually quite proud of himself for because he had a really hard time not swearing. So this seemed pretty mild. After that, Harry waited to see if the deputy would challenge him or say anything else, but he didn't. And moments later, Harry heard the deputy's footsteps crunching down the gravel driveway and heading back towards his cruiser. After that, Harry leaned back into his couch and smiled to himself and picked up his drink, kind of toasting himself for standing his ground, and at the same time sort of hoping that maybe now, finally, officials would understand that he was not going to change his mind. But that's not what happened. A little more than a week later, on the morning of April 5th, Harry sat in a folding chair in a clearing by his house with his binoculars pressed to his eyes and a glass of whiskey in the cup holder of his chair. This was an area of the woods near his house he called his cocktail lounge, where he'd often go to relax with a drink. It was covered by a thick canopy of evergreens, but it also had a great view of the mountains and also the lake. But Harry was not here to relax. He was actually on very high alert because the woods were absolutely crawling with federal agents and local law enforcement officers. Harry could literally see them right now through his binoculars, walking around the various camps they had set up all over the mountainside and also near the lake. And there was nobody to stop them because everybody else who lived in this forest had bowed to the pressure and left when told to, which meant Harry was quite literally the last resident still fighting the good fight. Now, so far, officials had not physically attempted to force him out, but now that Harry saw them assembling all over the mountainside, he had to wonder how long he had before they did try. But at the same time, he also knew that he had one piece of very important and very surprising leverage over the authorities, and that was that over the past couple of days, Harry's refusal to leave his wilderness home just because the government told him to had turned him into a media attraction. Reporters had heard about what was going on and they'd started coming to his house. Now, usually, Harry just did not like the press. Even though he clearly listened to the news himself, he still thought of the press, thought of the media like they were vultures, always looking for dead meat and chaos. But Harry also really liked to talk, and he had a lot of very strong opinions. And now, seeing his beautiful lake inundated by outsiders, Harry realized he had to take full advantage of this media interest in him if he wanted to stay in his home. Because the way he saw it was the government could really not make him do anything against his will if the whole world was watching. So over the next month, Harry gave a lot of interviews. And pretty quickly, he became kind of an international celebrity. He was this single older man standing up to something way bigger and way more powerful, which was sort of admirable, although people didn't really understand it, but it was still a big story. It was very interesting. But more than that, it seemed like the public just sort of liked Harry. In his interviews, Harry would swear and yell and rant and rave and tell reporters about how no authority figure would dare try to get him out of his house.
No, I'm not going to leave. You're damn right I'm not going to leave. I'm going to stay here. Damn right, this is my home. It's going to have to come and get me. And no authority can take me out of here. No authority dare.
And he'd also talk about his life, just telling these crazy stories that had nothing to do with the wilderness, like about the whiskey that he'd bottled and distilled during his Prohibition days, which he called Panther Pea, and about his relationship with his late wife and how they used to dance together at the edge of the lake, or his war stories from World War I. I mean, this guy was just really quite fascinating. And so by the time May rolled around that year, Harry went from being bombarded by the government to being bombarded by the media. Today, this would be like going crazy viral, where everybody's seeing you on their feed. But this is 1980, and so people got their news from newspapers and the television and the radio. But those mediums were all full of Harry, and people were kind of obsessed. Everybody from average citizens to school kids sent Harry fan mail, and reporters and news crews came to Harry's in droves, and some even took helicopters just to get there more quickly. And Harry, if he was being honest, he sort of relished all the attention. A few months earlier, he'd been happy with his quiet life, no phone, and he just had his 1,000 cats for company. But now, it's like the whole world cared about him, and it was pretty cool. A few weeks later, though, everything changed. On Sunday, May 18th, the sun came up on Harry's lodge, and the woods around it were totally quiet for the first time in weeks, because Harry, in some ways, had won. He had kept his word, and he'd stayed strong and refused to give in to the government's demands to leave. And finally, the government had backed down. And the sheriff had even come by the day before to tell Harry that, okay, no one's going to come by and ask you to leave anymore. It's on you. And so now, on May 18th, as Harry was getting up, it was just him, the lake, the trees, and the big, beautiful mountain. And then, at 8:32 a.m. that morning, a deafening boom shook the earth. It would turn out the media was not totally finished with the story of Harry R. Truman. In fact, what happened on the morning of May 18th, 1980, would in many ways make Harry even more famous than he already was. Because Harry didn't live at the base of just any old mountain. His lodge was situated directly at the foot of Mount St. Helens, which was an active volcano. The government operation that the federal agents and local law enforcement were trying to run here was an evacuation. They were not trying to impede on Harry's rights. They were trying to save him. But Harry was so convinced that the land he loved so much, that he had lived on for nearly 60 years, would not hurt him. And so he ignored the authorities' repeated warnings. But Harry's decision was the wrong one. And on May 18th, he paid for his mistake. Because that morning, Mount St. Helens erupted, sending an avalanche of searing lava and mud directly onto Spirit Lake and Harry's lodge, killing him and his cats instantly. His remains were never found. 57 people died during this eruption, including Harry. Today, in that area, Harry has both a trail and a ridge that are named after him. So in a way, he remains a part of the mountain that he loves so much. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to share 3 stories about missing people. Except the real take-home from each of these stories is not so much how or why these people went missing, but instead, it's the haunting circumstances surrounding each of their disappearances. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to fill up the like button's car with gas. But instead of actually doing that, just go ahead and permanently glue shut their gas cap. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. On the afternoon of April 10th, 1998, a 40-year-old woman named Diane Augutte stood at a bar inside the Hayloft Tavern in the small town of Hudson, Florida. Diane grabbed her glass off the bar and downed the last few sips of her drink, and even though by this point her vision was blurry and she actually felt sick to her stomach, she still yelled out to the bartender in a very slurred voice and told him to bring her another round. And the reason for this is because Diane actively wanted to get so drunk that she could just forget everything. Because at the moment, her life was kind of a disaster. So Diane used to be a married, stay-at-home mother with 3 kids that she loved so much, but about 10 years ago, she'd begun having some very serious mental health problems, and she'd ultimately been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. She would fall into these deep depressions that would make it almost impossible to function,
And then she would swing and have these manic episodes that would literally keep her up for days on end and left her so delirious that she would start talking to herself. Eventually, Diane's husband divorced her, and he got custody of their kids. Now, Diane's life had sort of leveled off. She was living with her sister, so she had some level of support, but her bipolar disorder really was not under control, in part because she had medication for it, but didn't always take it. And so she would swing in and out of mania and deep depressions all over again. And as a result of this, she had consistently been in and out of various psychiatric facilities multiple times. So on this particular night, Diane really just wanted to drown her sorrows. And so a couple of hours earlier, she had left her sister's house and walked to this bar because she didn't have a car. And she'd been standing around at this bar, basically pacing in circles and drinking alone ever since. Just then, the bartender came over. And even though Diane was seeing double, she immediately saw that he did not have another round in his hand. He had no more alcohol. The bartender gave Diane a look that was half annoyed and half sympathetic. And he told her he was cutting her off. And Diane was so mad. She began telling him that he didn't know what he was talking about, that this was humiliating, but he just put his hands up and said, "No, I'm sorry, you're cut off." And so eventually, very angrily, Diane turned and sort of stumbled out of the bar and began walking down the street. The next day, so April 11th, Diane's mother, Mildred, paced back and forth inside of her living room, holding a phone to her ear. It rang a couple of times, and then a dispatcher from the local police department picked up. At which point, Mildred told them in a shaky voice that she needed to report her daughter, Diane, missing. So a little while earlier, Mildred's other daughter, Diane's sister, the one that Diane lived with, had called to tell her that Diane had left the house the night before without telling her where she was going and still had not come home yet. And of course, based on Diane's history of mental illness and pretty erratic behavior, Mildred immediately felt like, oh my gosh, my daughter must be in trouble. So now, on the phone with police dispatch, Mildred explained the whole situation. She said that yes, it was possible that her daughter, Diane, had left and gone somewhere for some actual real purpose, but it was also entirely possible that she was having a manic episode and might have, in her mania, wandered off and gotten lost. The dispatcher said that she would send officers to interview Mildred and her other daughter, and they would start looking for Diane right away. But 4 days later, on April 15th, there was still no sign of Diane. That afternoon, Diane's mother, Mildred, checked in at the police station, like she had been every day since her daughter first went missing. But, just like always, the police didn't have any new information for her. So far, all they knew was on April 10th, the night Diane had left her sister's house without saying where she was going, they had figured out she had gone to the Hayloft Tavern and gotten so unbelievably drunk that the bartender had cut her off. And then at that point, she had walked out of the bar, and that was the last the bartender saw her. The following day, on April 11th, Diane had been sighted walking along Highway 19, which was just a couple of miles away from that tavern. And then she'd also been spotted near a locally owned motel right off the highway called the Coral Sands Motel. But after that, the police said they had no idea what happened to Diane, where she could have gone, or what could have happened to her. And so ultimately, Mildred left the police station feeling very disappointed and also scared. I mean, the whole drive back to her home, she felt absolutely sick with worry. She had no idea if her daughter was hiding somewhere on purpose, or if she'd gotten lost and was now injured, or maybe she was hungry, or if she'd maybe run into the wrong person and potentially been kidnapped, or worse. I mean, there's all these terrible scenarios playing out in her head. Finally, Mildred got back home and she went inside and she sat down on her couch and just tried to think about, what else she could do to find her daughter. And that's when she noticed she had a new voicemail on her answering machine. Mildred thought, maybe her other daughter had called while she was out and that was the voicemail. Or maybe it's something to do with Diane. But either way, she got up, she walked over, and she hit play. And what she heard made her feel sick to her stomach. What she heard was Diane's voice. And Diane sounded terrified. And she kept saying, "Help! Let me out!" Then there was sort of a scuffling sound on the recording, like somebody had grabbed the phone out of Diane's hand. And then Diane said something like, "Hey, give me that." And then the call just cut off. And so after hearing this, Mildred obviously went into a total panic. It's like, oh my gosh, all of the worst things that could have happened to my daughter must be happening. And so now, even though Mildred was completely upset, she's shaking with anxiety and fear, she grabbed the answering machine and looked for the caller ID to see, who left this message. But all it said was the call had come in from somewhere called Starlight, which didn't mean anything to Mildred. But she quickly, dialed this number back, hoping, whoever it was would pick up, but nobody answered. And so after that, Mildred called the police. This voicemail made it obvious to police that Diane had not left on purpose and she was not lost. It sounded like, at least based on this voicemail, that she had been kidnapped and was likely being held against her will. But as for where Diane was being held, the police had no idea. They couldn't trace the call to her specific location, and they couldn't figure out what this Starlight thing was either. So for another full day or so, the investigation, despite this new lead, basically floundered. There wasn't much to go on. That is until the next afternoon, on April 16th, so 5 days after Diane disappeared. On that day, the police got a call from a man who said he had just been walking along the side of Highway 19 and he had found something disturbing. He said he wasn't sure if the object was even real, but he thought, for sure the police should probably come check it out just in case. And so police immediately rushed out to the scene. They found this object, they sent it off for testing, and then they waited. And when the analysis came back, they learned two things. Number one, the object was definitely real. And number two, it belonged to Diane Auget. The object was the severed tip of a finger from her right hand. Over the next few years, people kept calling in sightings of Diane Auget to the police in Florida. And the police would look into it, and they would interview more than 100 people. But nothing ever panned out. The police never figured out what Starlight was, which is where that voicemail had originated from that was left on her mother's voicemail. And the police also never determined how or why Diane's finger was cut off. But despite all that, strange clues that definitely were tied to Diane kept turning up in some very strange places. Like, for example, the manager of a convenience store near where Diane lived found a bag of Diane's neatly folded clothing inside of their store's outdoor freezer. And a customer at a different nearby convenience store found a plastic bag full of toiletries, including eyeliner and perfume and lipstick, that was left behind on a countertop. And on it was scrawled the name Diane. But police were never able to figure out who placed the bag or why. And so unfortunately, today, Diane's case remains unsolved. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Sometimes I think about being a kid, riding in the back seat at night, street lights flashing across the window, no responsibilities, no real fear of the future. Well, if I could say something to that little kid version of me, I'd probably say, you're gonna be okay, but don't rush it, don't wish this away. Because when things get hard, it's easy to start looking backwards. Nostalgia is basically a highlight reel. And then you look at your present and it doesn't stand a chance. Here's the thing though, the life you are living right now, you're going to feel nostalgic for this someday. And so if you spend it longing for something that's already gone, you'll miss it twice. If reaching for the past is getting in the way of living now, therapy may help you figure out what you're actually looking for. And it might also help you to start finding more of that in the present. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly. And switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Around 3:30 p.m. on December 17, 1927, a 21-year-old sailor named Joe Stevens stood inside of a U.S. Navy submarine that was cruising underwater in Cape Cod Bay, about a mile off the coast of Massachusetts. Joe was at the front of the submarine, inside of a small windowless compartment called the torpedo room.
It was about 20 feet long by 10 feet wide, and on one side, there was a metal door that was open that led out to the rest of the submarine. The walls were lined with 6 bunks, a bunch of machinery, and also several torpedoes. And Joe was absolutely thrilled to be in this submarine, because Joe had always dreamed of working on a sub. When he was a kid, he'd actually made this fake periscope out of wood, which on a submarine, the periscope is like a set of binoculars, if you will, that kind of juts up above the submarine, and the submarine can rise just close to the surface, but right below, and the periscope perches kind of just barely out of the water, and it can look around to show you what else is nearby. And so with this fake periscope, Joe and his older sister Florence would spend hours and hours as kids pretending they were on a submarine deep underwater on all sorts of special missions. And so years later, when Joe turned 18, the first thing he did is he enlisted in the Navy. And recently, he had finally been assigned to actually working on this submarine. And it was really like, his childhood dream had finally come true. On this particular day, Joe was doing one of his very first test sails. Basically, he and the other 40 men on board the sub were just testing out all the different machinery on board to make sure everything was working correctly. And so Joe and 5 other men had been assigned specifically to work in the torpedo room. They stood by inside of this room and waited for a command from their captain to come through on the one-way intercom overhead. But as they're standing there, just sort of waiting around, sort of out of nowhere, Joe heard this grating, loud, metallic sound that kind of echoed through the whole submarine. In fact, the sub itself shook so hard during this sound that Joe and the others fell to the ground. And so immediately, Joe and his coworkers are scrambling to get to their feet. They're looking at each other like, what was that? But then it was like their worst nightmare began to play out, as water began to rush through that open door from the rest of the submarine into the torpedo room. And so as this absolutely horrifying scenario is playing out, Joe, his immediate reaction is actually this overwhelming sense of deja vu. Like just for a second, he felt like, I've experienced this exact moment before. But before he could actually process this feeling, a couple of his coworkers rushed past him and managed to slam that door that connected the torpedo room to the rest of the submarine. They shut it and they sealed it. So at this point, Joe has sort of snapped back to reality. He's not thinking about the deja vu thing. He's like, okay, what's going on? I mean, he realized there must have clearly been some kind of accident. I mean, basically everybody thought the same thing. That sound, the grating sound, the shaking in the water, I mean, that screams something has struck the torpedo, something's happened. He expected the captain's voice to come over the intercom, not to talk about the test run they were actually on here, but with orders about what they should do now that there was a real-world emergency playing out. And so for a couple of minutes, Joe and his fellow sailors just kind of sat there in this, sealed-off torpedo room waiting for this announcement. But there was nothing. And then Joe and the others felt a jolt as if the submarine had just settled at the bottom of the bay. At first, Joe and the 5 other sailors didn't panic. Whatever had happened, they knew clearly it was not good, but they also figured, maybe this was not a total emergency. It was bad, but maybe we can salvage this. After all, they were only about, 1 mile away from the nearest Coast Guard station. And even though Joe and the others inside the torpedo room did not have a way to actually reach out from where they were to the Coast Guard station, or anyone else for that matter, to call for help, they figured that somebody else in the other parts of the submarine would be able to punch out and call to the Coast Guard station and call for help. But the minutes turned into hours, and there was no progress. There was no obvious sign that any sort of rescue was underway. They didn't hear anything over the intercom. They couldn't even hear anything on the other side of the door. They figured by now one of their comrades would have come over and knocked on the door or in some way talked to them. But no, it's just silence. And also the emergency lights inside the torpedo room eventually flickered out. They're very likely on the bottom of the bay in this sealed room in total darkness. They also had no food and no water. That was in the other part of the submarine, but they couldn't open the door without risking more water coming in. So they're just totally trapped. Now, of course, all of that was horrible. For Joe and the others, they knew how dire this situation was. But the scariest part of the whole situation was that they knew there was a finite amount of oxygen inside of this sealed room. And with every breath they took in, they were using up that air supply.
And so pretty soon, this tiny metal torpedo room was starting to feel more like an underwater coffin. Joe began fading in and out of sleep. He sort of lost track of time, and he also was starting to lose hope. But then suddenly, Joe heard this loud, metallic clanging sound. And he realized someone was knocking on the outside of the submarine, like their rescue had clearly begun. And so Joe and the others immediately jumped out of their bunk, sort of knocking into each other because they can't see each other, and they went over to begin knocking back, signaling to whoever was out there that, hey, we're alive, we're still in here. By using Morse code, which is a method of communication via tapping, Joe was able to actually communicate with these folks outside the submarine. And he did confirm they were Coast Guard rescue divers, and they told Joe what happened. They explained that about 16 hours earlier, a Coast Guard ship had struck their submarine, it punctured the submarine, it sank, and everybody else, minus Joe and his people inside of the torpedo room, had all drowned. And so now the rescue divers were here to rescue Joe and the other people he was with. Now, when Joe and the others heard this news, I mean, this was horrifying, but also they're thinking, wow, had we not sealed that door as fast as we had, we would be dead. Like, we are so lucky to be alive. And so Joe, after hearing this message, he began frantically knocking back a message, basically saying like, well, great, but when are you gonna get us out of here? Because we're running out of air. It's getting hard to breathe in here. But the rescue divers could only tell him that they were doing their best and they would get them up as soon as possible. And this was definitely true. I mean, the Coast Guard was genuinely doing everything they could as quickly as they could to save Joe and the others. But the reality was, this was a really difficult problem to solve. You have people that are trapped inside of an air pocket deep underwater. If you open up any section of this air pocket, any section of the submarine, water will rush in so quickly that the pressure alone of that water rushing in would literally kill everybody inside. So that wasn't an option. You also have the fact that, as Joe said, they're running out of air. You have this compressed timeline to figure it out. And so really what it leaves you with is, okay, you need to basically quickly lift up the submarine, keeping everybody inside of it, and raise it to the surface. But this is in 1927. This is like a complicated thing to do with modern day technology, let alone 100 years ago. But that was sort of like their best chance, is bring in multiple ships with all these different strange lifts and somehow scoop the submarine and raise it to the surface before everybody inside suffocated. But the problem was, when they actually began organizing all these ships to try to lift up the submarine, there was this huge storm on the surface with really high winds that just battered the area, making it nearly impossible to position the different lifts off these ships. And unfortunately, this storm was going to be raging for days. And so while this catastrophe was playing off the coast of Massachusetts, about 100 miles away in Providence, Rhode Island, Joe's older sister, Florence, opened up a newspaper and read yet another article about the sunken submarine, where she knew her brother was trapped. For the last couple of days, Florence had been absolutely glued to her radio and the newspaper, desperate to hear or read some good news. But every article and every news segment, they said the same thing. The 6 men who were trapped inside the sub were definitely still alive. They were communicating with the divers, but the storm on the surface was still just too intense to rescue them. Florence felt so scared for her brother, and not just because the situation itself was objectively dangerous, but also because she remembered the submarine game that she and Joe used to play when they were little. And more specifically, she remembered the very last time they had ever played it. Joe had been about 4 years old, and the two of them had just finished another one of their make-believe missions, and they were supposed to be bringing their imaginary submarine back up to the surface. But then Joe had suddenly dropped his homemade wooden periscope, and he'd turned to Florence and said something so strange and so haunting for such a young child that Florence had never forgotten it. She had asked him to clarify and explain what he meant, but he had refused. And in fact, after this, he refused to play the submarine game ever again. Now, Florence hadn't thought about this in years, but now that she's seeing what's happening with her brother, it was all she could think about. A couple of days later, on December 22nd, so 5 days after the submarine had sunk, Florence received word that her brother Joe and all the other sailors in the torpedo room had died while waiting to be rescued. And Florence was totally grief-stricken. I mean, this was her baby brother who's just died in this horrible way. But also, strangely, for like the first time in her life, she felt like she actually understood what Joe had said all those years earlier when he was 4 years old, when they had played that last game of submarine. On that day, after dropping his periscope, he had turned to Florence and said, quote, "All hands were lost." This is an expression that's used in the Navy to mean everybody on board died, meaning their make-believe submarine had just sunk and everyone on board had died. And remember, after he said this, Florence tried to get, 4-year-old Joe to explain what he meant, but he wouldn't, and then he refused to play it ever again. And so now, in hindsight, Florence believed that her 4-year-old brother had predicted his own death. On the evening of April 19, 1989, a 62-year-old man named Thomas Meehan was sitting in his living room in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, watching some TV when his phone rang. Thomas picked up and said hello, and he heard his daughter, Patricia, on the other end. And right away, he could tell by Patricia's voice that she was feeling really down, which actually didn't surprise him. So Patricia was 37 years old, and Thomas knew she'd really been struggling lately. She lived almost 2,000 miles away from Pittsburgh in Bozeman, Montana, where she worked as a ranch hand. Now, she liked her job, mostly because she loved the animals, but she just had a really hard time getting along with people, and so she was sort of lonely. She didn't really have a lot of close friends, and recently she'd been through a breakup, and even though she'd always loved kids, she'd never had any of her own. And so to Thomas, it seemed like his daughter was just going through, basically a midlife crisis. And so as Thomas is listening to his daughter, just kind of, talking about her life generally and just sort of making small talk, he sort of cut through and just said, "Hey, what's going on? How are you doing?" And Patricia, she stopped and then sort of vaguely said that she was just under a lot of stress and that she was thinking about quitting her job and moving away from Bozeman. And she actually asked her dad if he'd be okay with her coming to Pittsburgh and maybe moving back in with him. And Thomas, who adored his daughter and really felt for her, immediately was like, "Of course, you can come home anytime you want." This definitely lightened Patricia's mood. And then she told her dad that she'd call him back the next day to make more solid plans. And then she said she loved him and she hung up. But the next day, Thomas did not get a call from Patricia. In fact, he never got another call from his daughter again. The following day, so April 20th at about 8:15 p.m., 1,500 miles away from Thomas's house in Pittsburgh, a woman named Carol Heights was driving down a very isolated 2-lane highway in the rural town of Circle, Montana. It was dark and cold outside, and all Carol could see was the one car driving in front of her. And beyond that, it was just big empty fields on either side of the highway. But, sort of out of nowhere, this car, which had just been putting along at the same speed as Carol, it suddenly swerved off the road. For a second, Carol was just so confused, what caused the car to suddenly veer out of the way? But then a split second later, Carol understood exactly what had happened. Because right in front of her was another car driving the wrong way, barreling down on her. And so Carol, she jammed on the brakes and she tried to swerve out of the way, same as this other car had. But she wasn't fast enough, and this other car smashed into her, basically head on. Carol felt her head snap back, there was this loud metallic crunching sound, and then blackness. But then just a couple of minutes later, Carol opened her eyes and realized she had survived the crash. She felt, pain in her neck, and her car's a mess, the airbags have deployed, obviously she's been in a serious wreck, but she's alive. And so eventually, Carol managed to open up her door and she climbed out, with the intention of actually checking on the other driver, because the other car that smashed into her is basically butted up against her and she can't really tell the status of this person. So she gets out and she's going over to see if this person's okay. But before she reached the other car, the other driver also climbed out of their car, and in the light from both cars' headlights, Carol could see that this other person was a middle-aged woman who appeared to have shoulder-length strawberry blonde hair. And this woman, didn't appear to be hurt, at least on the surface. In fact, weirdly, she seemed very, very calm. And this woman, she just stood there by her car, not saying a word to Carol or in any way recognizing what she had just done, which is drive the wrong way and smash into Carol. Could have killed Carol. No recognition of that. Instead, she just stood there, and then eventually she turned and just stared at Carol. And this was sort of alarming to Carol, and it caused her to just stop and also just stand there staring at this woman, not really sure what to do. And as Carol is like waiting to see what they're gonna do, the other driver, this middle-aged woman, just turned and started walking away. At this point, Carol yelled to her to stop, like, you can't go. We had this horrible accident, like we have to wait for authorities to get here. You can't just leave. But this woman, she didn't even look back to talk to Carol. She just calmly walked off the highway and then climbed over a fence into one of those big empty fields on the side of the road and just kept on walking until Carol couldn't see her anymore. She just vanished. When the police arrived about 45 minutes later at 9 p.m., they found the wreck and they found Carol, and this other driver again was just gone. And so they ran the license plate of the other car, the one that hit Carol's, and they learned that it was registered to 37-year-old Patricia Meehan. But beyond the fact that apparently Patricia had just wandered off here, the other weird thing about this was the registration showed that Patricia lived 400 miles away. So they really weren't sure what she was even doing all the way out here. Now, Patricia did not come back to the crash site, and so eventually police got canine units out there and they began looking for her. And they were able to find a trail of her footprints out in that field. And they followed that trail for hours and hours, but eventually the footprints just stopped and the dogs lost her scent. Now, police would continue looking for Patricia for nearly a week with no luck. I mean, they never found another trace of Patricia. It really was like she wandered into that field and just sort of vanished. But that was not the end of the story. Because about 2 weeks later, a totally unrelated police officer was eating at a fast food restaurant in Laverne, Minnesota, which was about 700 miles away from the crash site. Now, even though this officer lived and worked in a completely different state, they'd actually heard about Patricia Meehan's disappearance and seen pictures of her because her case was now national news. So when this officer looked across the restaurant he was in and saw a middle-aged woman with strawberry blonde hair sitting in a booth by herself, silently drinking water and just staring off into space, he immediately recognized her as Patricia. Now, the police officer had no idea if this really was Patricia. He was confident it was, but this just seems so random and so bizarre that she would be here, of all places. He also didn't know if this person was alone or not, or what she was even trying to do. So instead of getting up and going and talking to her, he just stayed in his seat and kept an eye on her. And for the next 5 hours, the woman he believed was Patricia just sat there in the booth, slowly drinking water, just staring off into space for 5 hours. Eventually, the restaurant closed, at which point an employee had to tell this woman to get up and go. They also told the officer that he too had to leave. And so after the officer and this woman who he thought was Patricia had left this restaurant, the officer kind of hung back and continued watching the woman, and she just went right across the street to a diner. And this time, the officer did not keep his distance. He went inside the diner, and he went right over to where she was sitting at a table, and he sat down next to her, and he just said, "What's your name?" And for a moment, the woman seemed kind of confused why, this random police officer was even sitting with her to begin with. But instead of, challenging the police officer, she just went quiet for a second, and then in a sort of hushed voice, she said that she was from Colorado. But then a moment later, she shook her head and said, "Actually, no, I'm from Israel." And then, before she gave up any more information, like her name or why she was here or anything, she jumped up out of her seat and ran outside. And the police officer was kind of caught off guard by this and was a little bit slow to get up and chase after her. But he ran outside too, and by the time he got out there, she had disappeared. Over the next month or so, the police in charge of Patricia's case received dozens of reports like this from people who believed they saw Patricia at restaurants and truck stops all over America. And the police actually confirmed many of these sightings, meaning they believed that these witnesses really did see Patricia. It was not just some lookalike. And in every case, witnesses reported that this woman, presumably Patricia, refused to speak and was just staring vacantly into space. She didn't seem to know who she was or what she was even doing. But also, in every one of these cases, before anybody could intervene or ask her questions or just help her in some way, Patricia would run off and disappear again. It was like Patricia was a ghost, appearing and disappearing over and over again all over the country. As of today, there have been over 5,000 reported sightings of Patricia Meehan, but still, we do not know where she is. Her case still today is open and unsolved. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.